Right.
So I've never seen a shit show like this. Just basic stuff is like so messed up, and I'm like, I can't do this, guys.
No.
Good morning. Hello. Good morning. How hungover are we? Thank you for coming. I'm Jeff Jarvis with the University of New York Graduate School of Journalism. I'm here with an incredible, amazing, esteemed panel of people to talk about the moral basis of the future. Nothing less. No, not enough? Okay, hold on. Hello.
Good.
Is that better?
9:30.
No.
Whoa!
Yay. Now it works.
Technology. Oh, now it's overboard. We down? Okay, there we go. Okay, now, good morning. No wonder you didn't say good morning. Good morning. I'm Jeff Jarvis from the City University of New York Graduate School of Journalism. I'm here with an amazing cadre of smart people to talk about the moral basis of the future. Maria Ressa, who is my journalistic hero, indeed, who, as we all know, is surviving brave conditions of journalism and standing up for what we believe in the Philippines. Indira Lakshmanan from Pointer, ethicist there. We need one. Janine Gibson, my dear friend from long ago in different lives, now heading up BuzzFeed UK and doing amazing journalistic work there. Raju Narazetti, most recently at Gizmodo Media Group, still. Also suffering valleys of death there too, I think, but managing to make that work. Let me give you just a moment's background on this odd topic. So I have been befriended by a guy named Dov Seidman at LRN, a company that helps companies understand their moral behavior. And he started a non-for-profit called the How Institute. And together we wanted to look at a higher level view of the moral bases of the decisions that are being made by both platform and media companies, and to understand what that is. And I've been talking to some smart people about this as I go, and one of the smartest I know is, of course, my friend and mentor, Jay Rosen. And Jay pointed out that we seem to have assumptions about what we expect of, for example, the platform companies, but we really don't have the terms of that discussion. We really haven't yet discussed what their public responsibilities are. What is it we expect of them? What are those ranges? So I'm going to try to work on this project, and I'm cheating by having all this room filled with smart brains help do that, and to start to discuss what's on the table and what's off the table when it comes to the ethical and moral bases and imperatives of the decisions that we are making. In our media world, for example, right now today we see, I should give you a full disclosure. I accepted money at my school from Facebook, Craig Newmark Philanthropies, Ford Foundation, AppNexus, and others to start the News Integrity Initiative headed by Molly Diaguiar, who is here somewhere on campus. I am independent of Facebook. I received no personal funds whatsoever from any of the platforms. End of disclosure. But if we look at our own media bases, where everyone's screaming about the business model of Facebook, well, it's the business model that we started. And a volume-based, attention-based business model in advertising takes you pretty inevitably now to clickbait. A subscription model, which we think is our salvation, also redlines journalism and makes it the property of the elite. These are moral bases of decisions. How the platforms operate. Do they have a responsibility to the public information and the public conversation? What is their responsibility to society? That is the incredibly broad question for this morning. And they were smart enough to put us up here before we were too tired at the end of the day. So that's it. That's all I really have to start with. And I wanted to turn it over to anyone in the panel to talk about what do you think is on the table and off the table when it comes to both platforms and media. What are our expectations of their moral behavior and responsibility in society? Nothing less than that. Maria.
Oh my gosh. Okay. I didn't want to be first. What are the moral and ethical basis? I mean, I think it's really simple. As a person, I would just say the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. And I think the biggest problem that we have right now is that the old world, the standards and ethics of traditional journalism, which we in this room live with, were groomed with, we grew up with, we created organizations with, that is a little bit stupid in the new world of platforms because it doesn't get you the reach, it doesn't get you all of the rewards that engagement does. So the dilemma, I think, and I'll shut up after this, is just to transition from our old world where we were handcuffed and actually voluntarily handcuffed ourselves because we understood the great responsibility that we had, to transition from that world to this new world where the tech guys made these decisions without any of the realization, without any of the standards and ethics that we walked into our businesses with. I think that's the biggest problem.
What were define the handcuffs, and was there anything wrong with our handcuffs?
So I won't go into the commercial yet, but in the practice of journalism, standards and ethics, right? You don't do this for yourself. You know from the very beginning that you were there responsible to get all sides. If we were in this room, the woman sitting here has a very different view from the guy sitting in the back, standing up, looking at me, waving my hand, right? And Jeff's view here. They're all accurate, they're all equal, they don't have to fight with each other. It was the journalist's role to actually pull that up into a big picture view and tell you the why. I think what's wrong is that now when we talk about moral and ethical, we forget the mission of journalism, which is more important today than at any other time, and that is meaning, right? We don't get stuck on the facts because those authoritarian leaders will get you to the molecule of water without context. And when they do that, then they can manipulate it into whichever way they want. So meaning, context, right.
So translate that into your platform. And I will confess fully that my own sin, I think now as I see as a sin, is that I was a dogmatist on behalf of openness. The internet is open, the internet is equal, the internet is edge to edge, and I still want to believe in that, but we didn't see how much that opened us to manipulation.
I think we saw it much, much earlier in the Philippines, and we certainly brought it to the platforms because we saw the manipulation that was happening. I always say that the Philippines is the harbinger. We were 6 months ahead of the United States, and now all of the data that is coming out is showing that exactly. How do we translate it? I think this idea of openness is bogus. Sorry, right? I love him, but we disagree on a few things. Because
no, I'm confessing the ills of my ways. Yes.
You know, in the end, I went back over when I started dealing with Facebook, when the problems started coming out, and they were the end of 2015, the beginning of 2016, and they went back to your responsibility when you build the house. You know, you can't let people come in and then just start shooting each other in your area of influence. That's why it goes right back to do unto others as you would have them do unto you, right? It's very fundamental in that sense. Our standards and ethics as journalists, we took them to the highest degree, but in the end, it comes down to that. They built this house, they invited us all in, and then they said, well, you guys shoot each other out, and in the end, if you can, and it's really mob rule, if you can get more people to take your side, then you can shoot anyone else.
So one more question for you while you're off the hook. So I hear here as a standard, to anticipate and
a responsibility, accountability. That's
right.
Sorry.
No, a responsibility and accountability to anticipate and protect from manipulation.
Absolutely.
Okay, so define manipulation.
Okay, well, I can say from what we've seen, right, which is to use both the technology, so that's bots, algorithms, and to actually create artificial consensus. That's what we've seen in the Philippines, and you've seen it in other parts of the world, where you can get people believing that turning right is the right way when the truth is turning left. And I know it gets into all of these things about what is truth and what is not truth, but in the end, we're all starting out in reality. And while the ideal was to give everyone, to empower everyone, someone still makes the call on which voice has the greatest power. In our democracies, it is the vote. On Facebook, on Twitter, it's algorithms programmed by human beings. So what were those implicit assumptions? They were mob rule assumptions. So that's got to be fixed, because you cannot treat the New York Times the same way that you would treat Joe Schmo blog talking about what great food there is in Perugia. Sorry. You know, it's like, these are fundamentals. There have to be some connection to reality. You can't just say, otherwise you get what we have, which is, you know, I feel like Alice in Wonderland and the Mad Hatter is in charge, and we got to get through it.
And the judgments are needed, and I think we see the beginning of Google, Facebook, and Twitter all starting to make judgments. And
why so late?
But some believe they shouldn't make judgments. We don't want them to make judgments. You want them to make judgments.
I think they have to. They built it.
Yes.
They have to. They have no choice. Every human being, you may not want to make a judgment or to make a call, but when you're involved in society, you do make a call just by basically choosing where do you sit. You made a call when you went into this room. You chose your seat. Simple, right? That determines your perspective.
Indira, so you have the job title of ethicist, which is
a daunting one.
Yes, but you think about this all the time. You think about this from a media perspective. So both from media perspective and from platform perspective. And I'm not saying the platforms are media companies. Let's put that argument off for another day.
I will. I'll say it.
I actually disagree, but that's why I will put it off. But from your perspective, what ties together the ethical bases?
Well, I have to say that as I was listening to Maria talk, I was thinking back to 20 years ago when Maria and I ran the streets of Asia together as correspondents. She for CNN, an Asia correspondent for CNN, and me, an Asia correspondent for the Boston Globe. And I was thinking about what a different time that was. And, you know, 20 years doesn't sound like a long time, but it is many, many, many lifetimes and generations in news gathering, in the sense that 20 years ago, the two of us were gatekeepers. We really were. We were the ones who were sort of observing what was happening, the fall of Suharto, you know, the East Timor revolution, the crisis, the economic crisis, all of those things, and we were deciding what our news consumers were going to get. And it was such a completely different way than it is now. And, you know, I think that it's easy for us who come from legacy media, and it's funny for me to call CNN legacy media, but truly in today's climate, you know, CNN is legacy media. Bloomberg, where I worked for 8 years, I consider legacy media now. Things have changed so much. And thinking back to how the change was so radical and happening under our feet, and we didn't even realize it. And between leaving Asia, I left in 2003, and in that year before I became our Latin America bureau chief, I was doing a Neiman Fellowship, you know, thinking about big thoughts, unaware that Mark Zuckerberg across campus was inventing Facebook. Literally. Like, everything I did that Neiman year is now just garbage. Who cares? It's nothing. Because a 17, 18-year-old kid was creating Facebook and completely changing the ground under my feet and every other journalist's feet forever. So, you know, I got to Latin America, you know, Facebook wasn't big yet. It was just new. And then I think about the change between that and coming to Washington, and how absolutely everything by the time I got to Washington in 2007 was completely different in the way we gather news and the way we delivered news, and over the last 10 years, how that's continued to change. I think from a media perspective, it's obvious what our moral imperatives are. They're the same that they always have been, which is to educate, to inform, you know, to connect people. In doing that, we have to be transparent. I'm a huge evangelist for transparency as a way of building trust in journalism, restoring trust in journalism. I can talk about that much more. But, you know, all of that goes back to, and we have to be accountable as news organizations. But it goes back to the sort of thing of, like, inform people, seek the truth, and, you know, minimize harm while you deliver, while you maximize your truth-telling. I think the thing with platform companies, and, you know, we can certainly debate what they are. I thought it was interesting that Sheryl Sandberg last week was interviewed by NPR, and Steve Inskeep, the host, opened up a question by asking her, so, you know, Facebook is a publisher, blah, 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 blah. He just stuck it into the question, obviously, to see what she would do, if she would dispute it. She didn't dispute it. She didn't correct him and say, Steve, I want to stop you there. We're not actually a publisher. She completely let it go, and she answered the question with him. Yesterday, Mark Zuckerberg, in his second day of testimony on Capitol Hill, was asked, are you a publisher? And he said, well, Congressman, if what your question is, do we have a responsibility for the content that is is on our platform, then yes, we do have a responsibility. So I thought that was interesting. He sort of sidestepped the thing, but they seem to be in a different place than they were even 6 months or a year ago on this. And I think where we get down to this question of where it becomes difficult is when you're educating, connecting, and above all for the platforms, connecting people and trying to create this open space, there are so many potential problems along the way that we've seen happen. And that's from misinformation, the spread of extremist content, the spread of hate speech, the incredible harassment to which particularly women and minorities are subject online, all of these bad things that come with having this open, connected system. And I think those are all, I'll stop, but I think those are all things that we need to grapple with as part of the moral responsibility.
All right. I think we have a bunch of assumptions about our ethical and moral responsibility in media. So let me since that's your job, let me stay with that for a second.
Sure.
The mess that we're in as a world right now, the polarization that we're in, don't we in media bear tremendous responsibility for that? That we put the world into two buckets, whether that's red and blue or white and black or whatever those buckets are. We have a structure that likes narrative and argument. We have a business model that favors clicks and invented that and attention for its own sake. Don't we need to do some more self-examination of our role in media before we start throwing rocks at the new kids?
I think we can do both at the same time. I don't think we just have to examine our house first and have every single, box checked before we criticize other people. We can do both, criticize ourselves and criticize them. But you're absolutely right that we have not done it perfectly. I'm not suggesting we have. And, there are different players in the media space. I'm not saying that everybody is the same and that everybody, I think everybody should have at their core, if they're news media companies, they should have these same values of educating and informing and, frankly speaking, creating the more digital that companies have become, the more that media companies, not just platforms, are also a platform for civic engagement and for civil conversation. We do that through comment sections. We do that in a whole host of ways. We certainly were not platforms, but we're also giving people a space to engage with us directly.
Shouldn't we be platforms?
Well, from a technological point of view, I can't really answer that, but I'm saying that we are creating platforms for people to have, hopefully, civil conversations, and it starts with old-fashioned radio call-in shows. I'm a regular guest host for public radio shows where people call in and they pick it up, and you give them a chance to air their views on the radio and talk to the guests, and, I'm always really, again, an evangelist for keeping it civil. Like everyone has a space to talk.
We've pretty much failed at that, haven't we?
I think, yeah, society has. And when you say this, that we like narrative structures that induce conflict, I think you're right about that. And I think it's a real problem. I personally have a real problem with both sides journalism, which has been a tradition for a long time of like, oh, well, blah, blah, blah. They say the world is round, but they say the world is flat. Let's ponder that. Yeah. I think particularly where we are now in a more polarized political environment than I've ever experienced in my life, I think that we do have to go back to our essential base proposition of being truth tellers. And if being truth tellers means we have to say, well, that side's actually not right, I think that's okay. I don't think you have to give equal balance to every argument. Like I am not, and actually you mentioned Jay Rosen. Jay Rosen tweeted something out last night, which I thought was really interesting. It was a New York Times article about climate change that did not give sort of equal weight to climate change denial. And Jay was making the point that this is an evolution. That a few years ago you would have still seen, well, this, but this, Nazis are bad, but some people say Nazis are good. We did see that just a few months ago, of course, and I don't think that's correct. I think we also have to, when some things are, it's not partisanship. It's about, some things are just morally right and wrong, or some things are just factually right and wrong, and we also have to be willing to call stuff out. That is our job as journalists.
Janine, you live across both worlds. Publication that we both love and respect, The Guardian, and then on to BuzzFeed, a publication that engages us. What did I say?
Hopefully we love and respect BuzzFeed too.
That's what I was about to get to. I was about to get to that. Yes, we do. And so, and all kinds of new ways. The news division of BuzzFeed has amazed in what it has done and really changed the entire brand and the entire view of the value of BuzzFeed. I do not hear cat list jokes anymore.
Well, you just made one, but okay.
Yeah, okay. So that's about bringing value into this new world. And you took the value we had and brought it in. Talk to me about your moral perspective across the two.
Well, yeah, I would just start from the thing that you said earlier in your introduction, that volume attention necessarily leads to clickbait. And obviously it can. That can be the ultimate expression of it. It can, however, lead to really good, important journalism that rises to the surface, that benefits from sharing and attention, that a story that you might start in quite a small way can multiply, 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 and have enormous world-changing impact. So we should be careful before we throw away the openness in an expression of sin. If you like, I will externalize for you your guilt about openness and try and figure a way through it.
Thank you, Doctor.
You're welcome. It's a moral philosophy round. I was just thinking when you were talking, when Guardian Unlimited started, when the Guardian first started publishing on the internet, and there were people in this room that remember this better than me even, but you know, we didn't have Twitter. We didn't really have Facebook. So if you want to think, oh God, what would the world be like if there were news organisations on the internet and not these hugely powerful platforms, then tragically I am old enough to remember what that world was. It existed. And I know what it was. It was a bunch of journalists and very sincere technologists who really, remember that naive time where we all wanted to change the world and we were genuinely excited about and scared of the power that we had. And we would sit in rooms drawing diagrams on whiteboards that we didn't really understand what we were doing. We were drawing information architecture. We didn't know what we were doing. But what we were doing it from was the principles that we had been schooled in and raised with, which were about informing, educating, hosting a conversation, spreading what we thought was the best possible information. We built armies of active moderators. When we finally built our own ability to publish comments, we built armies of moderators to make sure there was no hate speech, to try and correct misinformation. We used to have endless threads about climate change in which we would try and beat down the climate deniers. Every single day we would get up and do the good work.
We failed at that too, didn't we?
Yeah. I mean, it was Sisyphean, but you know, that's what we did. It never occurred to anybody in those early days of publishing on the internet to go, well, that's not our problem. No, nobody did that. And then, you know, along came Facebook Connect and people started to outsource the conversation. At that point, historically, if we look back, we outsourced responsibility for how you host that conversation and how you moderate it. And as a society, not as a media industry, but as a society, I suspect what we did was we were really liberal, indulgent parents to these nascent platforms. I'm this close to describing them as millennials. But
No, they're worse.
we did what we said was, oh, that's a really interesting thing. This has a huge amount of power to connect the world. It's got no real discernible business model, and it doesn't really seem to have any laws. But it's quite interesting. And then and we let it be. We just let it be. We let them tell us that they wouldn't be evil and that they just wanted to host conversation, and we let them be. As journalists, we bent over backwards. We were then raising teenagers, and we were giving them the bloody car keys. They said, we need you to do this. We need you to give us your articles. We need you to plug in our comment software. We need you to do video now. We need you to do it less than 3 seconds. Put words on it. And I feel like at this point, very liberal parents that didn't really take control of the situation and let it happen and happen and happen, and also a bit cheated, I think. We've come to events like this for many, many years, and journalists have beaten themselves up. I've sat on panels and said, we must be this, we must be that. I think the media has tried very earnestly to engage, to listen. It needed reform urgently. We were in all sorts of ivory-towered handing down the words. And it's been good for journalism in the main, for journalism, not distribution. But we sort of played by the rules, and we're looking around and going, oh, that didn't go so well. We did everything that they wanted us to do, and it did not, and we're still not rewarded for it. And what we've got is the New York Times treated with the same authority as a teenager in a bedroom, exactly as you say. So we can take responsibility for being liberal parents, but I'm afraid, like a liberal parent now, I now tend to feeling that we might have to go a bit authoritarian in correction, and that leads me to the regulation word, which we haven't used, and is probably not the right answer to a moral question. But I don't really
But you're British, so.
I'm British. I immediately went, if something must be done, pass a law.
Start a commission.
You wait till I get started on tax. But I genuinely do not see any other way right now. We've got a massive content problem. We've got a massive revenue problem. Those two things, it seems to me, can only now be combated by enforced regulation. I note that Mark Zuckerberg kindly acknowledged that he thought that perhaps he maybe should cooperate with maybe thinking about how regulation might happen. I feel like for about a year, most politicians and senior media figures have been sitting in rooms going, well, it's going to happen somehow. I'm not quite sure how, but it's going to happen. We can discuss what that regulation might look like, for as long as you like. I'm British, I will be available for the whole of the rest of the day to offer a brief history of regulation 1960 to the present day. But I would say this, as just a little final thought, it is worth asking why we are suddenly seeing all the platforms, not just Facebook, but all of them voluntarily taking responsibility for their actions. It is not because any of these problems have just come to light. They knew. They knew. They knew specifically about Cambridge Analytica. They knew what was happening with revenue. They started out sharing. They started to minimize the amount they were doing. And why was Zuckerberg in Congress this week? That was not the first time that they've been invited to go and speak to regulators. They have been telling the British Parliament to do one for about 5 years, and that's a perfectly respectable position. But the reason they are taking responsibility is because of journalism. Because journalists wrote stories, people got really angry, other journalists amplified stories, people got more angry, people used concrete examples to show what was happening, and that has forced the change. I think it is time for regulation to step up.
So I'm going to come back to the regulation, but let me pull back to what you said at the beginning in terms of trying to come up with a catalog of those areas of responsibility that they have, we have, or we share. What I heard you say is something that's helped inform my ever-changing definition of journalism. And I recently changed it to this, because I think, well, what does the world need in a time of polarization and the demonization of the other? I think we have a responsibility in journalism that also the platforms have to convene communities into civil, informed, and productive conversation. So is that notion of convening into a civil and productive and informed conversation, is that a responsibility that the platforms have?
Okay.
And putting a fence too around what's civil and uncivil.
But let's also just take it one step back. We do have a responsibility for the terms of conversation and for the terms of debate and discussion. And I think as legacy news organisations, we understood that very well. See my thing earlier about we convened armies of moderators and wrote rules for them and tried to codify what free speech was. But actually our responsibility, our real job, is to inform. Our job is to find stuff out and then say it and then tell people. And that's become very clarified, hugely clarified, much, much more distilled over the last few years. As we've combated fake news and bad actors and propaganda and deliberate misinformation, our role to be utterly rigorous about what we're saying and then hopefully build authority around it is really, the conversational bit, it needs the pure information behind it. You can't hope to have a good conversation unless we can agree on the facts. You can't have a great conversation about climate change unless you can agree that it is changing. And in order to do that, you need to have indisputable reporting going, that's the case. So yes, I'm not absenting us from the role of convener of good discussion, of a civilized society, but we need to be clear about what we can do in order to be clear about what their job is. And our job is to produce.
But is it their job to worry about the quality? I mean, Jack Dorsey put out his RFP recently saying that we're now going to pay attention to the health of the public conversation in the public sphere. So do you agree that that's their job, that they have to make decisions?
They absolutely do, and it has been expedient for them for a very long time to say, let 1,000 flowers bloom, everybody's voice is equal. Everybody's voice is not equal.
How British of you to say that too. All right, Congresswoman, write the legislation for us.
No, Roger.
I'm going to keep her on the hook for one more second. The regulation that you would like to create, what are the headings in that regulation?
I have been thinking about this a little bit. And I actually think in rooms all around the world, especially after, I don't know, a couple of drinks, somebody will come up with a theory of how we can regulate platforms. And there are loads of them. I wonder if data is probably the easiest way in. I think I tend towards a theory that people should be licensed for the access they have. Hi, British person. But you know, when television started, when we suddenly had that capacity, when we had the spectrum to broadcast into people's homes, then licenses were issued on the basis that that was an enormously powerful thing. You were going into people's homes. And by the way, I think the regulation of broadcast and the difference between the regulation of broadcast and the regulation of the internet is one of the problems in the spread of misinformation. If you are raised, and people older than everybody in this room, obviously because these are all babies, are raised with the expectation that if it's on television, it must be broadly true. I'm not talking about Fox News, I'm talking about British television news. But it's very highly regulated, and there is a sort of, you know, I remember the first time there was a made-up television scandal in the UK, and I remember my grandmother saying to me, but it was on television. It must be true. They can't say things that aren't true on television. At the moment, even advertising is regulated more effectively. And that's the problem with expectation. If you are sort of raised to believe that if it is put out, then it must be true, it's a huge cognitive dissonance to go, actually 98% of it is probably bullshit. So how did that happen? People were licensed, and as part of the license, they had conditions that they had to oblige by. It was a license to print money, and therefore, if you didn't abide by the conditions of your license, it was taken away from you. And there is now so much law being passed, especially in the EU, around data and what you can do in handling data and how much data you may hold and for how long and how you may share it. Every company that anybody here works for is spending a huge amount of time trying to work out how to recalibrate the way they own data. I don't know, maybe a good start is to think if you're going to hold the data of more than, say, 50 million people, then you have to be licensed to do that. There is law. And then you can attach conditions to it. I'm not actually a regulation expert. I know I'm a very enthusiastic hobbyist. But I think there are probably ways that you can do this and attach some conditions that aren't out of the bounds of feasibility if you accept that they are responsible.
Yeah, as an American, I get a little itchy when it comes to the idea of licensing the ability to hold information.
But when the US TV networks got too powerful, there was regulation that separated broadcast and production, that said these things are too powerful, they control too much of everybody's, and we are going to split them up.
Roger, sorry.
Good luck with that.
So the irony of talking about all this at a conference where the top 3 sponsors are Facebook, Google, and Amazon is interesting. Look, I think the fundamental issue I have is that we cannot outsource moral responsibility as individuals, as a profession, as a company, or as a platform. So the idea that we can point fingers and say that you have a moral responsibility to do something, I think it's good, but it can't be outsourced. So the reason I think Facebook got into its recent issues is because it outsourced the responsibility to Cambridge Analytica and others to kind of do something good or not bad with their data, and they just, so I think that's the fundamental issue that I'm having in thinking about this as who are we to kind of point fingers and say it. As an industry, look, I think journalism as an industry has been for a long time a pass-through industry, meaning that we just looked at it as saying our job is to take information and pass it through. We never really thought about the underlying business assumptions, and as our audiences became more digitally promiscuous, we are not a pass-through industry. We collect a lot of data, right? We now have to rely on that data, and it's not very different from what Facebook is kind of doing. So rather than kind of talk about it at a very philosophical level, I think I'm more interested in kind of saying, as I think Janine was saying, based on your question, what do we then do about it, right? So I think the notion that we treat those who collect data as fiduciary owners of data, I think is a good philosophical and a moral framework. And we do that, right? I mean, the most personal data we give out is usually to doctors and accountants and lawyers. All of them are actually governed by fiduciary ownership of data. They can not disclose it. There are lots of like both moral and ethical kind of guidelines around what they can do with it. So I think a similar idea that a Facebook has a fiduciary responsibility for data, I think would be a good way to think about it, and then say, okay, so what does that mean? And does that translate into certain ownership responsibilities? Am I giving them data and they can rent it from me and create a privacy economy in which I choose to participate and give me some value back, and I can decide how much of that value, right? Either they pay me or they put a digital wallet where they can say, for every piece of data that you want to give out to third parties, not individually, not aggregated, we put X into your digital wallet, and what you do with it, you can buy more services. I could argue for a case where I would say, actually donate my wallet to subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, or right? So I think there are lots of ways to think about it which are practical and have some moral underpinnings. And I think that may be a good way to kind of back into regulation, if you will.
Yeah, as you talk about that, I'm reminded of the early days of blogging. Oh, they were wonderful. We all loved each other, and we had blog rolls, and we hugged. And what is now portrayed as giving up data was then portrayed as sharing and speaking with the world. And what was seen as a good now is seen as kind of a danger. I mean, the information that was shared at Cambridge Analytica, and I could have this completely wrong, but a lot of it was stuff that you chose to make public. And that in the blogging days, we said the ability to create a platform to enable anyone to speak to the whole world was a good. Is it still?
The fundamental principle of it is still good, right? Meaning that there have never been more people able to consume journalism or information today than since the invention of the Gutenberg press. And I guarantee you more people read about Cambridge Analytica on Facebook and Twitter than if they were reading those two publications that actually published it. Right? So I think in that sense it's good. The question of like, should there be trust indicators and should there be things that say that the source matters and certain sources are better than the others, I think is not uncommon in sense that we've always kind of given some credence to that, right? I mean, you work at a university, and in the university setting, accreditation was a way to say, actually, they meet a certain threshold. So I think those notions are actually pretty good. I'd be very curious, actually. I think it's interesting that we talk about this as though it's a new issue, but Craig Newmark is here still somewhere, I think. I mean, he ran a platform called Craigslist, and I'd be curious to think about what were the moral imperatives that we associate with them. And there were we blamed them for a lot of our industry's woes, but I don't recall us saying, other than some classified ads kind of stuff, I don't recall us asking this question of Craigslist, saying what is the moral imperative? So I'll be curious, why is it that we suddenly are imposing this on Facebook and others and don't seem to think that it's an issue with some other platforms?
Are you okay to answer?
I can't speak for the company today, but back in '99 when I had to make some decisions about Craigslist, I decided to monetize as little as possible. It's a better model of philanthropy to have people keep the money they need to put food on the table than to collect that money and then to someday, maybe 30 years after, get to give it back to them. Also, in terms of privacy and so on, a principle is to collect as little as possible and to not even think about sharing it or selling it. it gets more complicated from there, but that's the gist.
When you spoke to my students many years ago at CUNY, and they asked you, as business people did, kind of, why don't you put advertising on and maximize this thing? You called yourself a philanthropist of classified ads. And that you were leaving money in the hands of the people to do what they wanted to with it. And then there's the fundamental economics of Craigslist were also that the less you charged, the larger you could grow, right? That the network economics were not bad. You used it to bring people that kind of benefit. Was that something you thought about at the time?
Not really. I'm not all that smart. And at that point, prior to my just stepping down as a CEO, I was just doing things that made sense, that felt right, speaking as a nerd of the 1950s, because that's where my values and so on are formed. Even in Sunday school, being told that I should learn to know when enough is enough. So just did it that way. And then a year after starting the company, really realizing that as a manager, I suck, turned it over to Jim, and he's continued that tradition. Seriously, though, I really do suck as a manager.
So I want to bring everybody into this conversation, but to where we stand so far, I hear you talking about the public conversation, maintaining the public conversation away from manipulation. I hear you talking about transparency as an ethic. I hear truth, a difficult standard. I hear data and fiduciary responsibility for data. And then I hear quality and making decisions about quality. One question, and then I want to see what all you want to ask about this and contribute. We believe that it's our job in journalism to inform the public conversation. One might argue we've done a fairly piss-poor job of it considering the quality of that public conversation, but we try. What responsibility do the platforms have to the informedness, that's a Facebook word, not mine, of the public conversation? Anybody?
What responsibility do the platforms
The platforms have to the informing the public.
Yeah. I absolutely think they have a responsibility, and I don't think it's enough to just say, we're an online community and we're connecting people, yay, more connections are better. More connections are great, but it has to be on the basis of the world is round, that whole truth part. And I think that that's why we got into this whole fight in the aftermath of the 2016 elections and Brexit and lots of other things about real content versus fake content. I don't want to use that term fake news because it's been appropriated and renamed and redefined.
Claire Ward will hit you.
And I agree. I don't want to be hit, but I agree. I think the word doesn't make it's lost meaning. It's become weaponized against journalists, and it doesn't mean what it used to mean. I wanted to just say one thing. In the list of words that you were throwing out, one word that you did not throw out, which I think belongs out there, and it's less about media because we have not, it's more about platforms, is privacy. We haven't put the word privacy explicitly on the list, although of course Raju was referring to it with talking about data. But I do think that that's something that we have to think about. And again, one of the comments that I think it was, maybe it was Dick Durbin who said to Mark Zuckerberg, would you feel comfortable telling everyone now, the world, where what hotel you stayed in last night? And Mark Zuckerberg said, no. And then he said, okay, and would you feel comfortable if we had all of your information and blah, blah, blah? And Mark Zuckerberg had to admit, no, I don't feel comfortable with that. So it is, I do think privacy is something there. And one other thing that I think is really important is safety is something about that civil conversation. And as a longtime national security foreign policy journalist, I go back to this extremism on the internet, and it does bother me. And Zuckerberg kept repeating this statistic for which he gave absolutely no proof and no basis, saying 99% of extremist content has been removed from Facebook. Really? Prove it. Like prove it to me. What does that even mean? 99%? Where did you get that figure? Right? And even if that were true, independently verifiable, which he has not verified for anybody, then even 1% with 2.2 billion registered users on Facebook And I don't want to just pick on Facebook. This applies to all platforms. Even 1% of that is a huge amount of extremist content. Just a couple days ago, there was some ISIS beheading videos on that you could find on the platforms. So, there's a whole lot of extremist, disturbing content out there that I don't think is education in the service of democracy. And I think we also have to remember that democracy itself, you talk about openness as a democratic value, and that was the sort of foundational principle of all this. But I think we had forgotten, we sort of maybe were, got lazy and forgot that democracy is vulnerable. And Maria is living that right now in the Philippines. It is vulnerable. It's vulnerable to malicious intent and malign actors and hate speech and extremism and misinformation and all sorts of things. And all the fact-checking in the world that we can do can ultimately maybe change people's minds on a discrete issue, but studies show it's also not changing people's votes and behavior. So these are
which
all
I think goes to
deep,
this question of the conversation.
problems.
But I also want to, and I tried with Roger, I'll raise it with you again, is yes, privacy matters, and we have many protections for privacy, but I would also argue that publicness matters. That the ability we have to publish now, anyone to speak, is an important new structure of the world, and I don't want any fucking one to stop Maria Ressa from publishing. Right? Whether that's a government or that's anyone else. And so the notion that Maria can be public or that anyone can be public is also part of this, Maria.
But,
oh, sorry.
No, just because, but just to what Janine said.
From speaking.
But as Janine said, not everybody's voice is equal. Maria's platform...
Which is an important change, and I think in the view we have of this internet thing, which Janine touched on earlier.
And Rappler is a legitimate, vetted news source that publishes real information, as opposed to someone used the word Joe Schmo, who's just making stuff up in his basement.
So let's be careful.
Not
let's be careful
yeah.
about maligning the Joe Schmoes, because we are all Joe Schmoes.
We're all Joe Schmoes.
Right? We don't want to be elitist and talk about just the people who are en masse again who are silent again.
No.
That's what I'm trying to say.
I'm not being elitist about it, but some people actually are using vetted facts, and some people like QAnon stuff on the internet or stuff you find down the Reddit channels or in 4chan, that is not actually true information. So guess what? That is not equal to voices of people who are actually gathering facts. That's not the same.
Okay, I'll jump off of some of what Indira said, which is, number one, we don't have to call Facebook or Twitter a publisher. They're the world's largest distributor of news. They're a distributor of news, and that comes with responsibility. Right now, again, those algorithms are using mob rule in order to determine how they distribute the news. That doesn't quite work. We all know that. And they really did this starting in 2015 when they took all of our platforms. And yes, we are news platforms now. We're just not as good as the tech platforms. And they took all of us into instant articles. And like Janine said, we walked in. Here we go. I put all of Rappler on instant articles. They're our best partner, right? They're frenemies that we want to do better, because as they do better, we will do better. 97% of Filipinos on the internet are on Facebook. That is our public space. The second is that terrorism research, we come from the same background. You guys remember in December 2015 when Mark Zuckerberg said, there's no fake news. There is nothing. It's 1%. He also used the same number.
Yeah, just made up number.
The platforms already know how to deal with terrorists and terrorist networks on their platforms. And this is where I come in, social network analysis. When you go through it, why do you have to wait for journalists to point out that the Internet Research Agency, and then you use that to pull out the network when you know what the malevolent networks are, because you have the data? And we have to turn cartwheels to be able to get that data. That's the first step. I think that, democracy is vulnerable, but more than that, George Orwell said it in 1984, right? The greatest power is to take what you know and then smash it into atom smithereens and then reformat it into what the platform wants. I've completely butchered that quote, but I'll tweet it, right? This is power. And, so I am living through this. We saw it very early. I feel like Cassandra, and we're still living through it. So push, please, do something about it.
Janine.
I think what really needs saying is that I don't believe that anyone wants to go back. I don't
Yes.
believe anybody, even the most rose-tinted version of when we were all gods of authority and power. I don't remember that time, but no, I don't think anyone wants to go back. I don't think anyone wants to give up the ability to distribute a story as far and as wide as possible, and to galvanize change, to generate conversation and action. And I truly believe that journalism has, in the main, been improved by opening up, by being less handing down words of wisdom, and being more open to the contributions that Joe Schmoes make. But you can sue the distributor for distributing a libelous story. You know, news agents, news distributors could be sued for distributing a libelous story. I'm absolutely not suggesting, even my radical regulation campaign, that we want to see a situation where Facebook and Twitter and Google are responsible for every story they publish. That would be ridiculous. However, and I come back to my liberal parents analogy, we can't just sit in the living room and go, it'd be really nice if you did some washing up occasionally. There needs to be some sort of mechanism. We are in this together. I think my point was, we tried earnestly to partner with them wherever they told us we were going. I'm not sure that's been a reciprocal relationship.
Roger.
I mean, I just want to remind us that we need to look in the mirror first before we do this. I guarantee you a majority of people in this room work at media companies that use Taboola and Outbrain, right? They're worse than Facebook, right? So we seem to have no problems doing exactly the kind of things that we blame the big platforms just because they have scale, right? So I think it's important for us to not be holier than thou about this. At the same time, demand better from all of us, right? So I think that idea that there should be standards, but we should begin by applying it to ourselves. And I must say that one of the things that we don't give enough credit for is until Facebook came along, we never had the ability to individually manage our data, right? Facebook actually gives you a lot of options. They make it very hard. You need to really pay attention to it. But until they came along, nothing you did on the internet you could actually control on your own. And I still don't know of a media company that gives us that ability to manage the data that they collect. I mean, you should go to any website and see the number of trackers and cookies they have, a lot less than Facebook, right? So I think it's important for us to kind of acknowledge that we have been bad actors as well.
It is true that every newspaper organisation that did a story last week about how to deactivate your Facebook page, detailed instructions on how to deactivate your Facebook profile, had about 1,600 Facebook trackers on the story.
And no instructions what to do about that. And Roger, you mentioned a very important word here, which is about the change, which is scale. Scale is the friend and the enemy at the same time. Scale is what enables every Sally Schmo to talk to every Joe Schmo across the world. But scale is also what makes it impossible to manage. Yeah. And at scale. Yes, Maria.
Sorry, just to be devil's advocate to Raju, though, I think that, yes, news publishers are doing that, but we don't have an army of engineers that are focused on just growing, using that data in a way that grows us in the way that the platforms do, right? So part of it is, I think, let's go back to where we started, which is that we each had our emails. People would go to the news groups, and we had communities we built organically before Facebook and Twitter ever came along. And we gave all of that to Facebook. So there's really such a difference. Yeah, okay, lots of us. I think there's that difference in scale fundamentally changes that world, right? It's the same way big data changes your Excel sheet. So that's why there's, I don't want us to be journalists because we really openly tear ourselves apart all the time, and let us not lose focus on what we need to do. There's a fundamental change, that change in scale, moving from an Excel sheet to big data, which is where it is, and those types of patterns that you only see when you have that kind of big data is very, very different from what individual news groups have, nor the competency of what individual tech people in news groups have.
Maria, to devil's advocate, you're devil's advocate. And then I am coming out here, is that I also believe that if there's a future for our business, and notice the conditional clause,
yes,
that I believe we have to move past mass. We have to move past treating everybody the same. That means that I've got to bring you greater relevance and value. That means I need to know you as an individual or member of a community. That means I have data on you. And we have no skills in our industry, let alone ethics. We have no skills whatsoever in our industry to know you as an individual and serve you better as a result. That's something we can actually learn from these guys and try to do it right.
But I don't know if that works, right? Because look, on Rappler, we have a choice. Are we going to personalize it, or are we going to give you the news? We have editorial judgment, right? You may not like that the budget has grown 7 times on intelligence funds of the Philippine government, but in less than a year, but you need to know that, right? So personalization, we made the choice not to do personalization, and we still grew. What we did is we walked into it as news groups. News people will do different things with this. And perhaps that's the thing. We do need to work with the platforms.
Well, then you also have to think about the scale of the individual. The Guardian publishes, I think in my memory, 500 to 600 pieces of content a day. The Wall Street Journal, how many pieces of content a day?
Yes. I mean,
hundreds.
At GMG, we published 88,000 pieces last year.
Okay, so my only point about that is the poor individual is outscaled. They can't deal with all that. We have to help them get to what matters to them. So that's, I don't think personalization's a bad in that sense.
But isn't that the echo chamber that then splinters us into groups? That's what I was trying, that's what we need to try to
Or is it relevant? The biggest group we're put in right now is the mass. You are all the same. You will all like the same product. That's a group you put into.
No, but the first thing that you do is when you do that search, you're already looking for what you want. So what we can serve them what they want. And then they can search again. So that the action point is in your hands, not an algorithm that is feeding you sneakers because you chose to look at
Janine, you were
sneakers
gonna
a week
jump in.
ago.
We can't complain about the fact that the New York Times is treated with the same authority as chap in bedroom if we cede all the authority of our editorial judgment, of our reporting, of our fact-checking, and say, yeah, no, I mean, I don't know what story is more important. Tell me what you want to read.
Right.
I mean,
Right.
All right, I'm coming down here.
So I'm going to try and turn this into... So I'm Peter Bale, I'm the launch editor of Wiki Tribune, and I'm going to try and turn this into a question rather than an assertion, but I'm absolutely in the middle of this at the moment at Wiki Tribune, and I can tell you that I no longer believe that neutrality is a possibility in news because it is all about judgment.
Welcome to the dark side, Peter.
And I say that after 100 years of working at Reuters 100 years ago, I am not going to publish stories which say Harvey Weinstein, good or bad, you decide. Women's harassment, does it actually exist? I am not going to publish that stuff anymore. Anyway, because I think there is an issue here, including where I am at the moment, between a US libertarian First Amendment and Rand view of the world, and another view of the world, which you know very well, which is Germany, a little bit of regulation. Let's also remember that one of the reasons why Spectrum was regulated was not just because it was important, but because it was a public asset. And so I think maybe there is an importance aspect here that we do have to get back to some regulation, but hopefully by people who actually know what they're talking about. But can you address this? No, I don't mean that you don't. I mean, I'm talking about politicians. This issue between... I mean, to me, the internet is fundamentally a First Amendment space, and the way it's been built is a fundamentally libertarian product.
Yes.
And that then bumps up, as Timothy Garton-Ash pointed out in his very, very good book, Free Speech, on this. It bumps up against German attitudes, it bumps up against cultural attitudes, and then it also bumps up against Chinese and single-party states. So how do we square that set of circles?
Yeah.
And you're right, as Lawrence Lessig says, code is law, and code is the Constitution. And code is also opinion, too. Everyone want to answer that quickly because I want to get voices from the room.
Well, I just want to say one thing and then defer to Raju, but since Janine used the word licensed, talking about in Britain, about broadcast being licensed, I mean, we are an unlicensed, set aside the FCC, okay, but we are an unlicensed profession in the United States. Journalists don't need to get licenses to be journalists, and so we're not regulated, and the free speech, absolutism that we have in the U.S., I think has sort of set the standard for the values that the platforms have. I do think it's problematic because I agree with Janine, who says that, people say, well, I saw it on TV, so it must be true. In Britain, there's some basis for thinking that. Unfortunately, in the United States, there's little basis for thinking that. When you say it saw it on TV, or our own president has said, well, I only know what I saw on the internet. Remember the famous Trump quote, well, I only know what I read on the internet. And, well, it must be true. true. I mean, obviously not. Obviously, the majority of what we see on the internet, I don't know if I can say majority, but a lot of stuff we see on the internet is not at all true. And I do think it's a problem. And I mean, I come out of that American system, but I don't know. I want to defer to Raju on this.
And Peter, the other issue we have is the quality of the government involved, which is an issue right now.
So I'm not sure that anybody in the U.S., well, I shouldn't speak for all of the U.S., but I think the consensus is that there is a problem. I think that the challenge becomes how do we address it, and that's where the free speech line gets used. So I don't think that anybody in the U.S. is necessarily saying be absolutist and don't do anything about it, right? I think that's the debate that the U.S. is having. I also must push back very strongly against citing Germany as the beacon of goodness, because what Germany and I think to an extent the EU have done is actually given more power to Google and Facebook to decide. Yes. In Germany, they passed the law. They were supposed to have a panel to adjudicate. None of that has happened. So Facebook is like fully empowered now because there is actually no ability to go to somebody else and discuss this or say, is this good or bad? So laws can sometimes really get ahead of trying to solve the problems we're trying to solve.
Let's come here.
Okay, so my Net Novak, I used to be the Swedish Media Commissioner. I was on the WEF board together with Raju a year ago. I just wanted to pick up on this because I think this is, we've had the call for more legislation. And having worked drafting media law, I know the difficulties. And I would like to say that I think legislation will backfire. We tend to think that, I mean, first of all, digital is transnational. So any law we pass somewhere will be good possibly in some context and backlash against this community in other contexts. I also believe that regulating the internet would hurt internet neutrality. So I don't think the idea of doing the same as we did with broadcasting and licensing, it doesn't work without having very dire consequences. And last of all, I would like to say that any regulation passed as a legislation, I think it could hurt journalism and freedom of speech. So I would like to throw a question to the panel about what about self-regulation?
And as the worst offender of this, I'm a fast-talking New Yorker. I've just been asked to remind everyone to slow down because it's easier for the translators, and I apologize personally because I am the worst. Go ahead and answer that, Maria, and then I'm going to come over here.
Okay, so I think, yes, in the Philippines, I testified in front of the Philippine Senate to say that, because imagine the people who will be creating the laws probably know less than the people on the platforms, as we've seen, right? So yes, self-regulation, but there must be, look, there are already existing laws that regulate journalists. Why are they not being used on platforms? I think there's this artificial boundary that the platforms are sticking to. That's first. But the second thing is on the last part is please let us not forget that free speech is being used to stifle free speech, right? That is what we're seeing. FreedomHouse.org November last year came out with a study that said in 65 countries around the world, in 30 of the 65 countries, they're seeing cheap armies on social media rolling back democracy. Who is protecting those people? The Philippines is one of those countries. And then finally, by sticking to this analysis paralysis, we're sticking, we're platform, is it whatever, is it media, who cares? The problem is here, it's now. People are dying in the global south, right? What are you gonna do about it? And if you can't do anything about it, then for God's sake, shut down in our countries. So, abdicating responsibility with no action or little action allows governments in other parts of the world to use the same exact tactic. And that's what's happening. We're seeing now, because Facebook has enabled an alternative reality and an alternative media in the Philippines, these pro-government bloggers, and it's not just the Philippines, you're talking about Myanmar, you're talking about Sri Lanka, you're talking about South Africa, you're talking about other countries, Venezuela, other countries here. These governments, our governments, are now using them instead of media. So shut down the problem first. Solve it. You can't wait 5 to 10 years. We're going to be dead by then.
We have 10 minutes left. I want to get voices from out here among the schmoes.
Thank you. My name is Mohammad Ittefaq, and I'm studying Masters in Media and Communication Science. I have a lot of questions, but I am just asking 2 or 3 questions. The first question is, yeah, like you, all of them talked about the function of the media to inform the people, but I think it was the function, but not now, because if you just Google, like, or you just searched one sentence, what is the function of media? So first you will get the answer, information, education, and entertainment. And then the second sentence would be the entertainment, entertainment, and entertainment. And then now, in the information age, if you just search this sentence again, so you will see the information, agenda setting, and propaganda. Because if you see the lot of international broadcasting companies like CNN, Effect, Russia Today, DW, so I always read about the refugees are becoming the prostitutes in Berlin. They have a lot of problems from the Russia Today. They have different perspective. So media do not have any kind of responsibility to inform only, but they are propagating and they are setting the propaganda and agenda. And the second thing about advertising, because the government paying the companies billions of the dollars in terms of advertisement about the health issues to inform people, but it's not just to inform people. They have a particular agenda to set, to think what they want to think people about. So they are setting agenda. So how media should survive to not to become particularly agenda setters or the propagandists of the advertisers. So how they can survive in this information age?
Let's keep it there. Yeah. Anyone want to respond?
When you were saying, oh, come on.
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a good point of view than a question per se, but there are lots of sessions for the next few days talking about how does media look past advertising, including one at 5:30 this evening. So I think it might be good to discuss this in that kind of a setting rather than moral imperatives.
All right, hold on.
And as for inform versus propaganda and entertain, you can't define, I mean, media is not a monolith, obviously. And within the term media, there's state-run media, there's propagandistic media, there's false information. I mean, so I think what we're talking about is the legitimate press here. And sorry for using a word if it sounds elitist, but there is legitimate fact-based. I'm part of the fact-based press universe. That's me. I'm sorry. I'm willing to own it, okay? I'm okay with that. I'm part of the fact-based press. And not everybody is part of the fact-based press.
And I just want to respond to the previous thing. Self-regulation is great, but back to liberal parenting. There has to be an or. There has to be. So it may be that everything I've said is completely specious, made-up nonsense. That's possible. But there has to be something that says if you don't self-regulate, then there is this consequence. And for journalists, that is self-regulation works actually pretty well. Yeah. And the consequence is if you don't self-regulate, you're going to be bankrupted in the libel courts. Yeah. Right. And I'm saying you cannot sue these platforms for every story they publish. You can't. But there has to be some other consequence.
And if you lie or plagiarize, you get fired and your reputation is gone.
Right.
But with the
we have codes of conduct that we all abide by.
Right, but with the platform self-regulating, I think Mark Zuckerberg has an overly optimistic view of artificial intelligence. Yeah. He thinks that artificial intelligence is going to detect fake and extremist content, and that's a great idea, but artificial intelligence can also be used by bad guys to circumvent detection. So I think humans are a vital part of the process.
My name is Courtney Radge. I'm with the Committee to Protect Journalists, and I did my doctoral research in Egypt, and it was very important that citizen journalists were able to go online and bring information to the public. And what I've been writing about recently is looking at how the algorithms and artificial intelligence that you actually just said were great have been leading to censorship of content being produced by citizen journalists and media outlets in Syria, in Myanmar, anti-Modi content in India. And so I want to hear, I think we understand the challenges for the mainstream news industry, but what are the challenges that you see for the unintended consequences of taking more extremist content offline? So you said, if 1% remains online, that's still a lot of content. But similarly, if you make 1% mistake with that amount of content, you've taken off a ton of legitimate content. So it's really challenging. And I think when we talk about self-regulation, you need the principles of transparency, accountability, and remedy. And right now, there's no independent audit or oversight for what Facebook or these other platforms are removing, and that should be available. We should be able to see the content that has been removed under these different schemes of countering hate speech or violent extremism or whatever. There needs to be remedy, and it shouldn't be so difficult to get information from Facebook. My question yesterday, what is your revenue sharing agreement with news organizations? Yeah. What news organizations are on free basics in specific countries? Why are we as media and researchers having to spend so much time to get very basic information?
Great.
Yeah.
Just, I'll give one specific example. There's a lot of debate about political ads on Facebook, and part of the problem is some of us see some of them and not everybody sees everything. So mandating that Facebook put all its political ads in a place that anybody can look at all of them, so not just see the ones targeted at you, would be a good start, right? California has a law that says if a data breach happens, you need to inform within a certain time those individuals. The advantage of a law like that is nobody knows where Californians live, so as a result, they're now informing everybody that there's a data leak. So there are practical ways to address these issues, I think, without necessarily getting into massive debates about the First Amendment.
So I think Egypt was a perfect example because they knew right away, early on, so they were 2011, right, and we were celebrating that. But the guy from Google, you guys remember Wael Ghonim? He, by 2015, was talking about the dangers. And when he told me, I was like, oh, really? I can't see. I was like, Jeff, I was like, this is so good in the Philippines. Well, it just took a little while longer. Here's a fundamental thing that we all in news groups use. People. We hire people. And why are tech platforms exempt from hiring people who make these judgment calls, who can then teach the algorithms, right? And then actually have to be liable for the wrong calls as we are. So that's the first, is $40 billion revenue in 2017 certainly means that they could do that, and they are. Mark Zuckerberg said that they would double, but I don't think that's enough given the base. The other part of that is that Google is far better at revenue sharing, so I see both the business and the journalism in Rappler, right? Facebook allowed us to scale at the beginning. We were a startup in 2012. We couldn't have become the third top online news site in a year and a half without Facebook. But at the same time, Facebook is also where we were attacked, where the propaganda machine, where government took over and reformulated reality. Let me just say state-sponsored hate, so I can't say government. State-sponsored hate, right? Most of the content creators now working for government. So the question there goes back to, is Facebook serious about tackling this problem? We prefer self-moderation, absolutely. But even in the moderation, these half attempts that they do, there's talk about the call centers being infiltrated by supporters. There's no transparency. So echoing what Indira said is the transparency. I guess those three things, that we already know where it's led. There must be an iterative process, which tech knows how to do better than journalists. Not doing anything, which it's been a year and a half now that we've been talking about this. Not doing anything is the worst thing. And then the third one is, if you're operating in countries with different systems and different cultures, for God's sake, please get somebody who understands the country you're operating in.
You know, but I've also been thinking lately, Maria, is that Zuckerberg has said that he's hiring 20,000 people to police this stuff. If you just look at so there's 20,000 shit pickers being hired, right?
For
how many?
2.3 billion.
True, and this is an international versus national comparison in the U.S. But there are now fewer than 30,000 journalists on daily newspapers in the U.S.
Right.
So what does that say about our priorities as a society right now? Forget companies, but just in general, is that we're forcing investment in trying to find the crap rather than create the quality. That's an issue. We've got like 1 minute left, so literally we've got 1 minute to share, and then we've got to go, and I apologize to.
So just really one quick thought. I love what you brought up, the woman from the Committee to Protect Journalists. All your points were excellent. And just to give you an example, literally just on Tuesday, a news organization, I don't want to name them, but raised with me the issue that they are trying to cover the Chinese government in a critical way. And this person said to me that basically YouTube is working with the Chinese government to remove all self-immolation videos of Tibetan monks and Tibetan activists, and what a problem this is, and how it's essentially YouTube is participating in the censorship of a political issue, and what a challenge that is for them. So that's a huge problem. I think that I see it as a problem. Facebook, remember, when they had the human moderators and were then slammed for deprioritizing conservative content, that is what bit them in the backside, and why I think they're so hesitant to bring on human moderators. And I'm not sure that I believe that the 10,000 are going to be doing what we're talking about doing, the 10 to 20,000 that he talked about. But anyway.
A 140 tweet from each, and then we'll...
I only want to amplify and agree fully with Maria and with what you're saying. This is hard and difficult and more expensive than using an algorithm, and yet still incredibly critical and important. These are the biggest companies in the world. At the beginning, we let them go, oh, we don't really have any revenue, we can't really afford it, it's not scalable. Nothing is true empirically. That is not the law of technology. It is hard and difficult and expensive, and they have to do it.
Raju, a final tweet?
Just throwing people at Facebook is not going to solve it. I think we are applying a very media, people come to us model that is totally busted anyway, and try to use that prism to solve Facebook's issues is not going to help.
So I want to thank everyone on the panel and everyone here, and I want to mention one more thing. Oh, applaud them, applaud them. Programming note, this afternoon at 3:15, I was scheduled to interview Campbell Brown from Facebook on stage. Campbell has withdrawn from the conference. However, we're going to go ahead and have a session about Facebook. And the challenge is, what should Facebook do for news? So very focused on journalism, and I urge you to come and join that conversation. And thank you for joining this one. Good day.
Scusate, vi preghiamo di lasciare la sala per consentire al nuovo pubblico di entrare. Please leave the room. Thank you.
It's 2014.
2014.
Did you see this?
Ah, no, yes.
Because I guess it's the idea of going from big numbers to situating them historically. So proud that the Guardian took on the mantle of keeping it in the ground.
It was good.
Such a nice
Got a sort of afterlife, hasn't it?
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today at our session, Connecting Science and Journalism Through Climate Change and Digital Innovation here in Perugia. My name is Rina. I work for an international research organization called the European Forest Institute, with offices all over Europe. We are organizing 2 sessions, really looking at the sort of intersection between the journalism and science, with a specific focus on the climate change. I want to give you why we are doing this. So first of all, as a science organization, we believe that there are much more we can do to connect these 2 communities. We are actually looking at, we have a lot of similarities between science and journalism. And we are looking at facts, we are always looking at evidences. We are also all about independence and the after accuracy and credibility. So we want to connect these 2 dots. We are connecting to these communities to be able to engage more, to understand what we can do with the climate change topic. And another thing that I'm a long-time participant of the International Journalism Festival here in Perugia, and also previously I've been working in the journalism field in the past 10 years. And then what we noticed that we have been talking a lot about digital innovation, we have been talking a lot about the new approaches, new way to tell stories, but can we link to this, to the topic that everyone in this room are being affected, climate change, that has a lot of different aspects that we can connect. And when we talk about community engagement, we can also connect with the audiences through the topic. So that's the reason why we are also looking at this. And then finally, we really want to see different sort of corners of the story. We tend to focus on risks. When we talk about climate change, when the disaster happens, we always go after that. There's a journalists, storytellers, but can we see it from different point of view, not just only focusing on the climate change, because it's very much interlinked to so many aspects of our life, economy, politics, and also everyday decision making. So in this session, we would like to kind of have a bird point of view, looking at the climate change at the broader perspective, to explore and understand where things are in terms of public understanding and public engagement about the topic. So we're going to be looking at the first half, we'll be looking at the challenges and threats that, when we look at the climate change debate. And then the second half, we'll be more focusing on what are the changes we need, what are the solutions, what can we actually do to change the process. And on that note, I would like to pass it on to my colleague, Elisabetta Attalla.
Thanks, Rita, and good morning, everybody. My name is Elisabetta Attalla. I am a science and data journalist. I come from Italy. I'm currently collaborating with Rina and the European Forest Institute on this process and issue and effort of trying to make scientists and journalists collaborate on a more long term to improve our coverage of climate change. So first of all, on a note of practical organization, we would like to ask you to send questions via Twitter with the hashtag of the festival and global change as hashtag. So global change will be the hashtag, will be searching for to collect your questions and put your questions as well to our panel. This is meant to be a very interactive social session, so please just really fire your questions and comments, and we will be trying to feed our conversation with our panelists through your questions as well. Of course, there will also be some space for like direct questions. We have an amazing panel today, and we're really, really happy. So I want to just tell you very briefly who are our guests. So Victoria Mikute, she's a producer for Contrast Voir, and she works for Al Jazeera. So it's going to be a very on-field sort of expertise we have here. John Riley, co-director of the MIT Joint Program on Global Change. So we have more the science side here, and Alok Shah, a public engagement fellow for the Wellcome Trust, but has more than, I think, 10 years experience on science coverage as well, field coverage. Alan Rusbridger now is like the principal at Lady Margaret Hall, University of Oxford. You know him also for his long time as the editor-in-chief of The Guardian. And Jonathan Gray, lecturer in critical infrastructure studies at the King's College London, again known at this festival as well for his work on data and data journalism handbook, and I think we will also see him in other panels in these days. So we go straight into, we just like dive into the topic, and I'll start with John Riley. We have asked our guests to focus, first of all, on the problem we're facing, so the challenge, but we really assure you we don't want a whiny session, so we're going to put some of the challenges and problems on the floor and then trying to look at what solutions and strategies we're dealing with. So let's start though with the challenge, John. What makes you stay awake at night, let's say, when we're dealing and the way we're dealing with climate change coverage and discussion today?
Well, thank you. So my perspective comes a lot from the US, and there the thing that concerns me the most is the deep divisions we see in the country where facts seem not to matter. And of course, as a scientist, I'm a producer of what I think are facts, and if they don't matter to people, then I'm irrelevant. So that's a concern, that if science has become irrelevant to some of these discussions. Social psychologists in the United States have identified some of this issue as kind of people identifying with a tribe, and so the climate change as a hoax or junk science or fake news is part of tribal identity with a set of issues that a group of people seem to have. And so actually penetrating this tribal belief threatens people and their tribal identity. They'll be kicked out or scorned by their tribe. That's a view, one sociology view of how it works. I think we can ask, why is the climate change a tribal issue? Well, one is it's global climate change, and that kind of, people have a lack of control. It's the globe, it's the world. What can I do? Nothing I can do will matter. And so that gives people a sense of helplessness. And also it requires probably central government and a global coordinated response. And for people in this tribe, that kind of threatens their sense of independence, or they're wanting to get government off their back. So the tendency then, I think, is human to just deny the existence of this because it's such a big threat. I can't live with it, so let's just deny the existence. So as I said, it's hard to penetrate this with data, facts, and info, and particularly troubling for scientists. I think we need to appeal to emotions at a personal level and a local level, and that challenges really scientists because our discipline has taught us to remove emotion from the analysis to make it cold, objective facts, and those are the things that don't communicate. And then getting down at the level we need to get to just stretches the ability of science to predict individual events and separate this idea of human-induced climate change from natural variability. So I think that's where, this understanding of how do we as scientists separate the natural events, the natural variability from that's human caused, convince people that there is something there.
Thank you, John. That's already a huge amount of issues on our floor. Alan, what keeps you awake at night?
Well, it's such a huge. I think it's the biggest story in the world, and the potential consequences of climate change probably don't need labouring in a room like this. except that it seems to me a story on which journalism has failed. It is in any rational accounting, the risks of what is likely to happen over the next generation in so many fields is so alarming. The fact that this is not on the front page or leading the bulletins of every news network every week is astonishing and worrying. And it makes you wonder why, and all the reasons are bad reasons, really. It could be to do with ideology, and John's mentioned that I think this is particularly true of the British press, that you've got quite a substantial, I would say, majority of the British press that are not inclined to believe in man-made climate change or the reality or the probability of the consequences of it. So that's a bad reason. It could be the economics of journalism are just not well suited to a story like this. I increasingly meet editors who are so driven by metrics, and that any story that doesn't meet the particular metric that drives that newsroom then is not going to make the news agenda, and that seems to me a very sort of alarming, self-reinforcing cycle of ignoring this story. It could be that journalism itself is just not well suited to a huge subject like climate change, which journalism likes things that happened yesterday, which you can describe and attribute to a reason. It's very bad at saying, well, this could happen in 20 years' time, or here's the thing that happens yesterday, but we're not sure that we can blame this on climate change. And it could be, I mean, clearly the public themselves, if the public is apathetic about this, you know, to the degree to which journalism can be blamed for that. But that's what journalism should do. Journalism should be finding ways of energizing and dramatizing stories and making them interesting and making the public take interest. But at the moment, the short answer to your question is that you have this enormously threatening, menacing, important story which is just not being covered.
Thank you, Alan. I just want to remind you to fire your questions and comments via Twitter. Okay, we're going to put the hashtag on board, but it's global change. So, okay. Jonathan, your question and challenge.
Yeah, no, I agree that it's a very big story, but I guess I'd emphasise a slightly different frame in a way, which is that the question of how we tell stories about climate change raises a lot of interesting challenges about the way that we imagine the relationship between science, journalism, and democracy, which is, of course, where you know, as a researcher, you could have a field day. You know, but I'll just mention a few of those things which kind of draw on recent research. I think the first thing is it challenges the notion of the public. And this is something that people have been debating about since the early 20th century, people like Walter Lippmann and John Dewey, who suggest that the notion of the public is perhaps not so useful when it comes to thinking about what journalism does and what journalism is supposed to do. And instead, there's kind of shift towards publics who are held together by particular issues that concern them or by particular arrangements through which they're kind of gathered as a public. And I agree with Alan that there's a sort of tension between the way in which media organizations gather groups as publics through what some have called the industrial construction of the audience, through these different practices of measuring and bundling up attention, which is often, for example, sold to advertisers or used to inform kind of editorial in all sorts of ways, and which, of course, is not entirely unrelated to the question of kind of filter bubbles and tribes. In a sense, if you shift from the public to publics, it raises a lot of sort of interesting questions about what you imagine the contribution to be. I guess the second thing that people have been studying a lot since the 1980s and 1990s is what's called the deficit model. It's the idea that the role of the journalist is to supply people with the facts. or with information about climate change. I think that's something that has been widely challenged, and still something we need to kind of keep reminding ourselves is not the only thing that sort of, journalists should be doing. I think the other sort of question is, what do stories about climate change do? What is it we imagine that those stories produce socially? I think that's something that I think about a lot in terms of, even if you kind of have these more complex stories and more interesting stories, what is the contribution of those stories to tackling climate change, and how is that supposed to work? I guess as well, there is a kind of tension between the phenomenon of climate change as a very complex, kind of multi-layered phenomenon, and the values of the news, including things like recency and the temporality of a story and how it unfolds and how you kind of find threads within it that you can use to select and narrate aspects of this very complex issue in a way which kind of fits with the news cycle. Something that we've seen a lot, I guess, more in the last decade than in this one, is this kind of question of balance. It challenges different editorial practices of trying to kind of give sort of equal column inches to different sides of an issue, which I think we often found was disproportionate if you compared the column inches that we'd be giving to climate skeptics to, for example, their role in the scientific literature or in relation to kind of key sources. And I guess finally, there's a kind of question of how one, on the one hand, tells stories about kind of climate science, which is made powerful by taking only very small aspects of the world, whether it's kind of temperature change or kind of species diversity, and it's reducing sort of the phenomena that makes it kind of very powerful. Yet at the same time, you miss out many things, as John was saying, whether it's kind of culture or sort of the social or political context of these studies. But
thank you, Jonathan. Alok, from your point of view, with your experience as a reporter and journalist, so which are the major problems?
Thank you. Okay, so I'm going to just build on some of the things we've heard already. I mean, I agree with a lot of the sectoral challenges and the failures in journalism that we've heard about. And I'll lay out a couple of challenges that I think that we face in reporting on climate change and making people engaged with it. One is, what worries me most about the current state of public understanding of climate change? Well, it's the fact that climate change is complex and nuanced, and journalism is neither of those things. I have spent a long time talking to scientists about how they can get their news into journalism, and I would always start with that. Science is deliberate, it's objective, it's incremental, it's slow, it's self-referential, and it's careful. Journalism is almost none of those things. It's the direct opposite. But having said that, this is the format we have for news, and so if you want to get on board, then this is how you do it. I'm largely believing now that actually we need to, and journalism, start to change how we do this. So we exist, if you're a specialist journalist, like I've been for a long time, you operate within a certain set of formats in mainstream news, whether it's news or features or documentary, that exist, that have been created for very different types of stories to the ones that we're having to tell now. We've not innovated in those formats. We've not created new ones, new storytelling narratives. We've not created new, you've not used technology to give the impressions of complexity and nuance that I think that the public deserves. So my challenge is, can we as journalists spend a bit of time, maybe a small percentage of our time, thinking how to reframe the kinds of stories we want to tell, rather than just forcing them into the narratives that were created a century ago for politics and argumentation on that front. They don't work for the sort of global level societal challenges that we face now. And I don't just mean climate change. I'm talking about antimicrobial resistance. I'm talking about artificial intelligence. These are complex technological stories that require people to have a deep understanding, not at the sort of level of like the actual scientists themselves, but at least an understanding that there is complexity there, and that complexity is not something to be shied away from. I've not met a single news editor in my life who's ever said to me, "Oh, look, yeah, make that story more complex." It's not going to happen. But are there ways of bringing news or nuance into it? I don't have an answer, but I want journalists of all stripes to start thinking about how we do this. Can we do some R&D? Can we try some experiments? And it doesn't mean that we have to somehow come up with some massively new format that involves, dancing on the ice poles or something. It simply could mean, can we think about how to bring audiences in at a much earlier level so that they have more transparency about what we're doing, who have more direction of what we journalists are doing? Can we allow them to direct some of the journalism that we do so that we're answering their questions rather than just the questions that we think they want to know? There are an infinite number of questions we could ask each other. I feel like journalists just never do this, and I feel like we should. The problem with not explaining uncertainty and nuance and all that complexity is all around us. With climate change, there are lots of uncertainties about what happens, what can be attributed and what can't be attributed to large-scale changes. And those shades of grey, which are very comfortable for scientists to talk about, mean that for the rest of us, there are lots of people who can use the sort of shadows to sort of make things up and not believe in facts. So that's the cost. So if we journalists don't improve our storytelling and our formats, these are the costs that we have. And I've got more ideas, but we'll come to them later.
Well, we will have time, hopefully, to bring more and more ideas. Victoria, from your point of view.
Yeah, so what has been keeping me awake at night is how to explain a very complex issue in my 4 to 5 minute virtual reality documentary. And so what I do, I create virtual reality documentaries, and I'm a part of Contrast VR, which is Al Jazeera's in-house media studio. We launched only last year in April 2017. And what stories we tell stories of the communities from Global South, from the developing world, and through people who are innovating, who are striving and to bring about change in those communities. So we were very excited to collaborate with European Forest Institute to actually tell the story, to do a story on climate change through people that are actually affected by it. And we benefited from EFI, from scientific expertise and context, and what they benefit from us is, the skill set, the skills how to tell the stories and how to tell these human-centered stories. And I want to show the trailer of the documentary that I've been working on, which is about the disappearing oases of Morocco. So let's take a look. You will see a flat image, so it's not a 360 mode, but let's just imagine how it would look like if you would put a virtual reality headset and you would see it in like a 360 space. So let's take a look and let's see how, and then I will tell you what are my challenges.
هاد الواحة هي اللي شاداني هنايا وهي اللي كتجيب لي القوت ديال العيش ديالي باش كناكل. هذاك الشيء دابا ديال البلاد تصح مشات مسكين على عند سيدي ربي وهاد الساعه قلالت ما بقى والو كطيح لك في واحد الوقت اللي غير مناسبه.
كنحس بانه كاينه واحد لانجستيس حنا في هذه المناطق ما كنخلقوش هاد المسببات ديال التغيرات حنا غير اون سوبي. كل عام انت كدوز في واحد البلاصه كتشوف الصحراء كتزاد كتشوف الرمله كتزاد كتدخل يعني كتخوى من بنو ادم. ملي ما يكون بنو ادم راه صافي راه هذاك هو العنصر اللي يمكن يحبس لك التصحر.
تضوي كيف القمرة واللي شافك يا برام تضوي كيف القمرة واللي شافك يا برام.
So it really hasn't been an easy task to explain such a complex issue as we're saying. Even here, like climate change is one of the causes of oases disappearing and then appear. There are so many other causes, and I've been talking to many researchers about it. And always, I was reading a lot of studies and papers, and the difficulties I found, I always asked them, please explain this to me. Please talk to the language that I would explain, and I could translate this to my audience, because there is this gap, and the language is really difficult to understand as being a journalist, especially the one who doesn't cover climate change all the time. And we had to make so many cuts. I always made a new cut, and I would show it to my colleagues, to my senior producers, and I would ask, do you understand the issue? Is it all clear? And there would always something come up, no, there's something missing. We have to explain this. We have to include that issue. We have to include that text and all that kind of stuff. So it's been really challenging how to make it engaging, informative, factual, and also, you know, to tell the story that everyone would understand and everyone would care about it.
Thank you, Victoria. So if we can see, I think we can have the hashtag. I've been told global change is too busy, and so please, can you use this hashtag to fire your questions? And so we will try to collect them and start using them in the conversation. But as we promised, we want now to turn from the problem and challenge and start to look into how we can actually tackle these problems and how we can try to respond. And maybe a lot of key words already came up, like trying to be more integrated or trying to be more transparent and so on. But I'll just give John back the microphone to start and see what's your view of how we can try to turn this problem into something that we are dealing with in a proper way.
So I guess I'm kind of struck by just the conversation that, you know, what is the role of journalism? Is it really to inform or drive us to some conclusion, or is it just to inform us about debates that are going on? So I guess the question is, how much of the responsibility for informing people is journalist responsibility, or what are the different forms of journalism that could be helpful? I think Elizabeth's work seems to be driven very directly by this sort of thing, making the problem personal, connecting to people, and it's hard work, as you suggest, because it's not easy for scientists or for you. I think, you know, drawing from the news of the hour, right, we're concerned about war in Syria, and there is this kind of debate going on, can the U.S. respond in some broad way with an aerial attack? We know those don't work, and I think climate change, we have to be worried that we can't expect a kind of an aerial attack, broad international journalism to give a story or two and that convince everyone. It is a ground game. It's boots on the ground, if you will. Reporters working in all parts of the world, getting trust of their audience and trust of local people and connecting. So I think it's a big war effort, and if we go in only with half the resources, then we aren't going to come out successful, is my sense. But
before I pass on to Alan, John, can you just give us a very quick word on the fact that you are working, like you've done a lot of experience of actually talking to people directly, local communities. So maybe that's also a process that can help, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we go into local communities in the United States and talk about, it's an area affected by coastal climate change, the sea level is rising, people can connect to that because they see it as their problem and they see ways in which the local community can respond to it. The hard thing is connecting that back, I think, as was said earlier, how does that connect back to whether we should really slow greenhouse gases, because this community doesn't have control over that. So connecting this complex issue of a small issue back to the global issue and making it all integrate is, I think, the challenge.
Alan, what's your view on that? How can we improve this process?
Well, just a couple of things which we can broaden out for discussion. So the first was a piece of advice from Bill McKibben, who will be known to some of you, who was a journalist and is now a campaigner. And his advice to me when I was editing was, stop treating this as a climate change story. You have this in a ghetto of coverage, and we've moved beyond climate change. So take it beyond the environmental reporters and make all your reporters cover this beat. So this is a story about security, it's a story about immigration, it's a story about food, it's a story about sport, it's a story about politics, certainly a story about economics. So all these people ought to be covering this story and stop covering it as a climate change. We know the science, and the more you make it look as though the science is something that's up for debate, the more you're going to have this as a ghetto. So I think that was a good piece of advice, and if you told me that earlier in my career, I would have taken heed of it. the second thing is that right at the end of when I was editing, we decided to do a campaign around this, because I think if there was too much of a sense of fatalism that you read these stories about which it looked as though you could do nothing as a reader. So this terrible thing is about to happen to me. I feel too depressed. I can't even really bear to read about it because it's so frightening. And so we did a big campaign. We called it Keep It in the Ground. And it was really putting the onus back on the reader and saying, well, there are things you can do about your pensions and about disinvesting from fossil fuels. And you can put pressure on your college, your pension scheme, your workplace. And that did seem to be a technique that got people interested again in this subject. And watching that campaign now ripple out across campuses and faith organizations and charities and a program of divestment. I'm not saying that was all to do with our story, but nevertheless it was a way of dramatizing a story that people, I think, had stopped reading and given the reader some agency in it.
Thank you, Alan. I think before we go with Jonathan, we have a few questions that are coming up in comments, right? So we can put them on the floor and comment them.
Yeah, actually, there's a lot. So one question was about how do we make people value more of this huge problem, climate change, when fake news and royal families' newborns make more clicks and views? There's another one, what approaches in data journalism have most successfully enabled reporting of complex global issues and which have, in your mind, failed? I'm not sure if there's anyone who can respond to that. There's another comment saying that can we connect more to like the climate change topic to its consequence of our near world, such as climate migrants, conflicts, social inequalities. Just a comment.
I think, Jonathan, you have a challenge here. Try to include include this and go forward. Yeah.
I'm going to mention 4 things, and I think very conveniently they kind of intersect a little bit with some of the questions anyway. But I'll leave it there, and then we can have more space for discussion. I guess I'm going to mention 4 opportunities, 4 things that I'm excited about, which don't just keep me awake at night because I'm worrying, but keep me excited about things. Sort of sites of experimentation, as it were. The first is, while the power of a lot of the scientific research has been to decontextualize what we were talking about earlier, things like temperature, species diversity, and to render those things comparable across space and time, to pick up these big trends and patterns. That's tremendously exciting. At the same time, I think I'm also excited about this kind of turn towards bringing the social, political, and cultural contexts of climate change back into the story. And I guess just to kind of illustrate a little bit what I mean by that, even things like the IPCC debates, they're tremendously rich and interesting when you study sort of the negotiation process to see how all of these different interests converge and are managed and kind of coordinated through the negotiations process. So there's a project called Climaps, which I think you can find at climaps.eu, which is a kind of project undertaken by several of my colleagues, which looks at everything from the kind of mapping topics across the IPCC debates and how they kind of change over time, even looking at things like climate fiction or kind of cli-fi, as I think it's called, which is kind of gives you all these different imaginaries about sort of big kind of climatic event, but also things like assessing vulnerability. How do you assess the vulnerability of a country and allocate funding? I mean, there was this big claim, I think a few years ago, that there was this kind of shift from the idea of mitigating climate change or finding out ways of stopping it to adapting to it. And you see that reflected in some of these debates about how money is allocated. And I think surfacing these different sorts of matters of concern, surfacing these kinds of political questions is probably going to remain quite important, and not to feel like those things are being bracketed and sort of in discussing kind of, you know, sort of the big questions about temperature change and sort of parts per million, you don't lose some of that kind of historical and cultural and political context. And indeed, I think Alan and his colleagues at The Guardian did a nice job of that when they were looking at carbon emission trends over time. We were just looking at a piece called, I think it's Carbon Emissions Past, Present and Future. And that shows a little bit over time, since the sort of Industrial Revolution, how different countries kind of emitted sort of over time. So that's the first. Sorry. The second is, and I'll be quicker. The there's a tremendous potential for visual and storytelling formats for making sense of this issue and finding different ways to experience it. And I think that, you know, even just take the very simple conventions like graphs. I think there's been a huge amount of interesting work in data journalism and digital journalism, looking at how you can annotate and draw attention to different aspects of the visual representation of data, how you sequence that, which is extremely interesting to explore for communicators and other people doing public engagement work around science. I guess the third thing is actually in the wake of all of these big scientific controversies around things like you know, leaked emails and sort of climate skepticism, I actually think it's a really nice opportunity to bring in narratives about what you could even kind of consider the fragility of science, how science is actually something that requires work, time, reflection. You know, there's all of this labor involved in the production of a fact. A fact isn't something that just immediately stands by itself. And I think, and indeed, it's not self-evident, and I think that's partly the point. So surfacing the labor involved in science, I think, is a really nice thing to kind of gradually bring into the story, particularly vis-a-vis skepticism, in fact, because I think then you start to see the asymmetry between different sorts of facts which are produced in this sort of debate. And the final thing is not just kind of the provision of information and analysis, but also different forms of interactivity and engagement. So how, for example, data sources or stories can assemble groups together in ways that perhaps might be different from, you know, climate skepticism as tribal marker, you know, to see how different people might engage and interact with the issue through digital technologies and through different storytelling techniques. And I guess I'm thinking here particularly of things like recent experiments around air quality, where you kind of do things like data walks, or this, you kind of use sensor technologies, and that's, you know, there's interesting ways in forming and assembling publics around the issue. But,
thank you. And Alok, on the note of engagement, I think there are lots of things that you're also looking into in terms of how to change a bit the way we report about climate change.
So I think there are two ways to look through this. Yeah. No, it's okay. There are two ways to sort of come up with solutions to this. We've heard about here's lots of information out there, how can we communicate it better, which I think is a really important way of the standard journalistic process to say, look, there are all these other sources of information, how do you make it meaningful to people? And I think that's important. But for me, what I'm interested in at the moment, and I think we should be more interested in as journalists, is to look from the other end of this telescope, which is that I really want people to be empowered and engaged. So you start from that position, you think, well, what will make them empowered and engaged about a topic like this? And one way of finding out is to ask people. And I don't think that we as journalists do that very much. I don't mean market research in the sense of, do you like this article or do you not? But simply allowing people to have conversations about climate change, ethnographies, if you will, watching what they're talking about, what they're misunderstanding, what they care about, and then using that in your decision-making to then go forward with journalism. So there's a good example of this with a website called AL.com, which is a main sort of news website in the southern United States. And they wanted to cover healthcare slightly differently to the rest of their colleagues. And so they had the people in Washington doing all the Congress politics stuff. But then they also sent 3 or 4 reporters out into the field to sit in truck stops, ride along with truck drivers, sit in cafes, just listening to people talking about healthcare, maybe asking a question or two, but nothing for reporting quotes. They came back a few weeks later to their editors and had essentially a whole list of misunderstandings, gaps in knowledge, an understanding of what people actually cared about when it came to healthcare. And then they commissioned a series of articles and stories and so on based on those things. Now, that's not radically complicated. You're not creating some sort of new interactive format or something. You're still writing stories and making videos and those sorts of things. But the commissioning process was very different. I think with climate, we can do something similar. We can ask people what they actually care about. Or in fact, if you want to be more better social scientists than that, you have to work out what they care about even if they don't tell you. So you're not asking directly questions. I think that asking people what they want, involving them perhaps, in the decisions you make around the content you're producing is good. It makes your process much more transparent, more trustworthy, both things we need in a time when people don't trust anything they read, or they don't trust experts, or whatever you want to believe. When facts are negotiable, I think that all of that is useful if you can bring them behind the curtain with you, especially groups that may not read what you're doing normally, and actually engage with them at an earlier stage. I think that's a very powerful way of building audience, building transparency, and building trust in something like this. Plus also, I'm sad to say that as specialist journalists, we don't know everything about the subject. We will genuinely get new lines of inquiry, new stories from actually asking our audience what to do.
Thank you, Alok. So, Victoria, I think on this note, you can actually share also your experience of going and listening to the community in this case, right?
Yes, that's true. I also want to talk a little bit before then about technology, and we were talking about the new ways of telling the stories. And so I want to think like whether actually technology can help us. And virtual reality is one of the ways that we actually can see those changes, and I think it's very powerful to transport the viewer to those faraway places, because those communities that really are affected by climate change most of the time are really far away, far to reach, somewhere in the rainforest, somewhere in the desert, you know, Amazon, somewhere. So it's a really powerful tool, and we should use it. But what's happening, it's still the story, it's most important. And even if I'm doing the story in VR, the visuals are very powerful, and I think they really show what's going on. The story is still the most important, and it's still challenging. So my point of how to make it more engaging and interesting, it's still very valuable, even if we find more innovative ways to telling these kind of stories. So, but about talking with people and actually going into those communities. So what I think that most of the time climate change stories are too sensationalized, in a sense that we care about them only when disasters get hit and when it becomes a world news story and all the media is covering some event somewhere, and then we all discuss, oh wow, maybe it's really something changing, and we start digging into facts and talking to scientists when these events happen. But I think we should focus on the communities. We should shift the focus and actually cover those communities that are affected by climate change every day, and their daily life really is connected to those changes and to those things. As, for example, we saw the farmer in the documentary, Habib. He's actually telling that the rain is sporadic, and he's really he cannot find water. They're actually showing us the places, and they're saying how it was only 10 years ago, how many trees were around, how it was totally different, and how they're actually a fear for the future. So what happens when we talk to those people, we also can ask what they do to change their situations. And the solutions that they have come up with are very important and should be important to us as somebody, as journalists, as scientists. So I think getting these solutions from local communities, from people, and then we can actually think about long-term participatory approach, how to solve it on the global scale. And that's what we try to do in Contrast. We try not to just cover the story, but also ask people and show people who are bringing about change, trying to do something. Because that's what they were telling me in Morocco as well. We are doing these things, and we can advise what we think could be right. Like the one person was saying us, we want to save every drop of rain. We want to do it, and we need help from the science community, from media that would come cover us, that somebody would see what's happening here, and we find the solutions together. And they said we cannot do it alone because it's a global change, right? So I think that's very important to actually learn from those people on the ground, and we need to do it every day, not only when a disaster hits and all the journalists are running to some place to cover and ask people how they feel about it.
Thank you, Victoria. I think we have some more questions.
Yeah, actually, Alok and Victoria touched upon that. But yeah, some of you are talking about climate change as a science story, others as a community story. Can you go around the panel and then have each say how they want climate change should be covered and why? Maybe we can, because I think Alok and Victoria touched upon that, so maybe we can cover that. And then if there's any questions, we're also gathering questions from the room as well.
Yeah, we could collect a couple of questions, yeah. Okay,
so thank you, Rina, and thank you, the panel, for the great start of the discussion. So I have two comments here, basically. So when we talk about interacting with the audience, there are many ways to do that. And there's one startup company called Harken, H-E-A-R-K-E-N, Harken. Maybe some of you know it already. They work with different media outlets to dig user comments and the questions, the reader comments, where a reader asks a question under an article which has been actually ignored for some reason, but nowadays some outlets really want to try getting story ideas from the readers. So that's one way of interacting with the audience, and I find it quite interesting. And another comment is there is this UNFCCC's Momentum for Change, where they reward communities, local communities, on different types of local climate solutions, mitigation solutions that they come up with in fashion or anything. And when I approached certain outlets as a freelancer, it was difficult to get those stories out. So we may need opportunities for that.
Thank you. We have 2 or 3 more. Yeah.
Yeah, hi. Is this working? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
My name is James Painter, Reuters Institute. James Painter, Reuters Institute. I have about 25 questions, but I'll keep it to one comment and one question. So the comment, I think, great. You've covered a vast array of topics, but my recommendation would be, next time you do it, why don't we have a business editor or a health correspondent on the panel saying, explaining why they do or don't cover the issue. I think it would be in some ways an incredibly helpful addition to these very helpful comments. There's a lot of evidence from the literature that if you give readers solutions rather than doom and gloom, you're going to get more engagement, although that's contested by some. The extraordinary fact about journalism is that there's very few pieces that combine both analysis of the problem and solutions. And I'm just wondering whether that's possible for journalists to include solutions. So at the end of articles, say, by the way, there's something you can do about this. It's not all doom and gloom. And secondly, just on the polarization issue that John mentioned, I think the real issue for journalism in the UK and the US and Australia, where climate change is very polarized, is how do you get narratives that appeal to a right-leaning audience, that break down this polarization? Because the harsh reality is that climate change, unfortunately, is a Guardian reader topic, and it's not a right-leaning topic. So what are the narratives? That's where we have to have a much better debate that can appeal to right-leaning audiences in those countries where it's heavily polarized. Thanks very much.
Thank you. I think we have 2 more questions, and then we go back to the panel for a round of comments and answers.
See, hi, my name is Tosca Ballerini. I am a scientist and a journalist together. So I agree with the pieces that talk about solutions so that they can give hope. So that was one comment. The other comment was about how about to include talking about risks when you have to explain uncertainty in scientific data, because risk is something that people may be they may know better than the uncertainty that it's used in the scientific debate. So that could be one way to do. And then my question is, but it's something that sometimes I ask also myself, who are we writing for? For the communities, for the managers, for the policymakers? What is the objective of what we write? How can we be more effective? What do we want to achieve with our pieces? So do we want to educate someone about an issue? So we want to let them know how a climate model works? Or we want to them start doing something? So, because sometimes for example, I am also working on the issue of plastic pollution, And I ask myself, is it better to tell everybody don't take a plastic bottle, or go to a policymaker and push to have laws that forbid to produce plastic bottles? So this is a reflection. I would like to have your comments on this. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there is a last one that we can collect, if you can.
Oh, so
yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No? Right, okay. So thanks for interesting discussion. I'm a scientific journalist, freelance journalist from Switzerland, one of the richest countries in the world, and I think the awareness about climate change is quite high in Switzerland. But fighting climate change means also changing one's lifestyle, which is unpleasant. For instance, flying less, eat no meat. And sometimes it's depressing to see you cover a story and well, nothing changes afterwards. I mean, not directly from the story, but taking, for instance, flying, I think this is quite simple to understand that flying is bad for climate change. But still, I think the numbers goes up, especially also in Switzerland. So just taking a step backwards, what are your thoughts?
Yeah. So I think we have we have a lot of hints and questions and comments. I ask each of you of maybe pick one or two and do a round of comments, because we're getting to the end of the session. I just want, we have 10 minutes, I know, so we might have time for a round and maybe a couple of answers. I also want to stress the point that this is not like a session that's going, I mean, it's ending today, but the process we started, it's really a discussion process. We want to keep open, and we'll probably let you know afterwards. Like, we want to post on the on all of our sites and maybe on the festival website a post with all the ideas we collected, and ask you to keep this conversation going. But I just go back and do the round. John.
So I guess I'm struck by one of the questions, who are we writing for? And I think there is this issue we've seen. Are you reporting about science to people, or are you reporting on what's happening to people for decision makers? So I mean, when we see war stories or hunger or poverty stories, if they don't enter the news, they often don't enter the discussion at all. So I think there's a big role for reporters in different places, as you've been doing, to kind of highlight the personal hardship that people are having, and that brings attention to not only to scientists, so you're communicating to science as much as you're communicating to science. So I think that's fantastic. I think the kind of what would I like to see journalists do, I think, I agree completely with Alan's sort of point that we need to wrap this into every component of stories. It affects everything, and it needs to be integral to those parts of the stories. We've done that on our own website, to not talk about climate change, but talk about food, water, forestry, energy, natural ecosystems, urban air pollution, health, those sorts of things. So I think wrapping it into the everyday life and connecting that to people is really critical. I was also I thought around your riff about, I spent a lot of time in Washington, D.C., and there the news on public policy is reported as the fate of personalities in Washington. So you never really read about the news. You read about what's happening to this cabinet secretary or that congressman, and then the story is about that. So I guess it's kind of interesting to think that can that be a draw to people about climate change, reading about the docudrama of personal and how science evolves. That'd be kind of an interesting story. So I'll stop there.
Thank you, John. Alan, I'll go in the same round. So.
Okay, let me try just very quickly four of those things that have come up. So the first is about clicks, and it touches on what I said earlier about metrics. If you work in a newsroom where, to take one example I heard recently, the only metric is what drives subscriptions. It's the only metric for whether you can cover a story or a genre of story. Then climate change is probably not something you're going to cover. So I think we have to think about what are the metrics that we set for our newsrooms and for journalisms. On James's question about narratives, I think it would really make Paul Dacre interested in this subject if he just wrote about immigration. If you think the pressure on immigration is bad now, just imagine what the pressure on immigration is going to be like in 10 years' time as drought hits Morocco and North Africa. On risk and data, a question about that. The answer seems to me obvious. In newsrooms, you have to have more people like Alok in newsrooms, people who can do their sums, and more people like Simon Rogers, who used to work for The Guardian, now at Google, who can visualize and work with data. And there are not enough people who are numerate and who have scientific training working in newsrooms. And finally, just on the question about nuance and complexity, I imagine there's going to be a lot of kicking of social media over the next few days. But there's an awful lot of nuance and complexity in social media. I'm terribly struck by how I now listen to so many podcasts, because podcasts will allow people to talk for 45 minutes, for an hour, in the way that the BBC simply won't nowadays. There's an awful lot of highly trained expert people on social media who simply won't let people get away with the kind of things and the sloppiness and dishonesties in this subject that would have passed unnoticed 10 years ago. So I think we ought to celebrate the role of social media in that too.
Thank you, Alan. Jonathan.
So I'm going to talk about one of my sort of little pet obsessions at the moment, which I use for teaching a lot, which is Italo Calvino, the writer. Just before he died, wrote a series of lectures on writing. And the first lecture was on lightness and the virtues of lightness, and how it's very tempting to think about bringing complexity, bringing richness. And when he was younger, he always used to kind of try and tell stories that would kind of bring all this kind of complexity. But there's also a kind of virtue of the way he puts it, kind of subtracting weight from characters, from cities, from heavenly bodies, all this kind of thing. But I guess the thing that excites me here is there are many different ways of doing that. There's many different ways of subtracting weight from an issue to draw attention to different parts of the story. So I guess one thing that excites me is telling different sorts of stories about climate change, which on the one hand, can be things like digital interactives and VR and some of these other forms of experimentation. But I think what's exciting, if you are a journalist and you're kind of trying to cover this area, is that it also need not be expensive, it need not be time-consuming, but attending to different aspects of the situation beyond the kind of sort of familiar stories, I think is an interesting place to experiment. And of course, in that regard, we will need a plurality of different approaches to telling these stories. And just to give kind of one example from colleagues in Paris, they're kind of, how do we rethink this kind of big story from kind of the land towards the globe and the kind of failure of globalization in many ways, and to look at our interdependency in other ways. How do we narrate that from kind of production and sort of supply chains to how we kind of think of how carbon emissions are allocated to nation states and this kind of thing. And I guess the final thing on that front I would say is, as John I think was alluded to right at the beginning, also really paying attention to other sorts of stories about climate change and how this can also play into other sorts of questions of political identity and act as kind of tribal markers. I think following even things like misinformation, so-called fake news, and seeing the significance of those ways of identifying with sort of climate change debates and different ways of narrating is really important.
Thank you. So we still have 2 minutes each, Alok and then Victoria, so we're doing a quick round. Alok.
Thanks, Elizabeth. James, it's almost like you've read my notes, or rather helped me write them. The thing is that I agree with you about solutions, and this is something that I've become very interested in. Solutions. The Solutions Journalism Network is here, the representatives are here, where you talk about a story from the point of view of a solution, and it can be done, it's empowering, and it gets people to see things that I don't think they would see otherwise. So not just go somewhere and say, oh, this is terrible, isn't it? But rather talk about a solution that's going on there and use that as the net framing for describing that problem in the first place. I think that's a fantastic and empowering way of doing things, and it's proving more and more successful. There's a podcast the World Service has launched recently called People Fixing the World, which is essentially this. People have taken solutions-focused journalism in different directions, in different places, but I encourage you to find those things and build on them as journalists. Don't just report the problem. I think you can report the problem in the third paragraph, have the solution at the top. I'm a big fan of that. On the question of the divide, the ideological divide, the usual way of thinking about that has been to frame this as a more than science topic. This is, as Alan said, a business story, a science, politics story, and a sports story. The one issue with that is that you do get into the politics of personality, as John said. I've done a number of times that stories that I think are important climate stories are taken over by political correspondents who are only concerned about which MP they're going to be pissing off or not. It's quite depressing. So yes, carry on with all that, and I think that's important that we spread these stories out and they're not in the ghetto of science. But I think there's a step we can take backwards from that, which is simply, once again, I'll say this, and if I'm sorry if I'm a stuck record, let's ask those people what they want to read and what they care about. Let's find out what they care about and to those stories, not just doing all from our own newsrooms.
Thank you, Alok. Victoria.
So I think what I mentioned before, that showing effects, how it affects communities, is still the most important way, because this is how we relate as audience, as human beings, to other human being who is suffering and who can tell how their daily lives look like. And when we make people care about those stories, then we can include the facts and slip in the facts, and then make this people stick. People will remember those facts. Maybe they will go to look for more stories. How these facts, the changes affect other people in other regions. So that's really important. And to the question, what's our audience, and if we tell story to the global audience, does the same story stick to policymakers? So I think the answer is yes, because if the story is really strong, powerful, and the way of telling that story is really powerful, you can reach policymakers as well. And for example, one of our documentaries about Rohingya refugees, we showcased the virtual reality documentaries at the UN Security Council to the policymakers. And what they said, that actually they read a lot of news about Rohingya refugees. They're always reading, they're always hearing about it. But they said actually seeing that story with your own eyes made them understand it even better. So we have to look for these ways, and we have to making these stories powerful and trying to find these new ways to make these stories maybe even more powerful, and bringing them to global audience and to these policymakers and to scientists and everyone, to bridge the gaps between, because policymakers are also detached, so we have to bridge the gaps, and we have to look for these ways.
So thank you all for your contribution, and I hand over to Rina for the final remark.
Yeah. Thank you so much for staying around. Just a quick announcement. So if you want to follow and then come up, come join us to, for this conversation, we have a session at 2 o'clock. If you can put it on the screen. Yeah, there you go. Yeah, so we have at 2 o'clock, we have a session at the Sala Priori, focusing on the challenges that the climate change reporting is facing. And then we want to have this very interactive session together with you to gather some of the ideas for solutions that we identify as challenges around the climate change reporting. And if you want to follow the debate, if you can make sure to keep this hashtag, that'd be really great. And on a final note, we are supporting journalists who want to experiment with innovative storytelling using climate change, focusing on the climate change. So if you're interested in getting small grants from us, of course, the editorial independence is all due to you. It'd be really good if you can come back to me. And then thank you so much, Elisabetta, Victoria, John, Alok, Alan, and Jonathan for joining us. And thank you guys.
Access to reliable quality information should be a right of anybody, wherever they live.
Today, the journalism industry faces many challenges.
Readership has become more fragmented, and in many ways, the experience of journalism has become more fragmented.
How can news organizations remain relevant in the digital age?
The traditional world of news media is shifting ever more quickly.
70% of people can't distinguish between a real story and fake news.
Disinformation is on the rise. Trust in media is falling. Journalists are having to do more with less.
A lot of the solutions will come from the journalism industry and the tech industry working together.
So, we're announcing the Google News Initiative, our effort to enable journalism to thrive in a digital age. It will enable new models for sustainable journalism, elevate quality journalism, and ensure that technology allows journalists to do their jobs even better.
The solutions to the challenges that the industry is facing has to come from the right mix of journalism and technology.
I'm really optimistic about the future of journalism. We just need to find the best ways for it to be able to flourish.
I think there will always be a hunger for high-quality journalism.
I think it's never been more important for us to work together.
And it's only through collaboration that we can do journalism in new and powerful ways. Because when journalism succeeds, we all do better.
Okay, good morning. Hi, everybody. So I'm just going to present. Okay, I'm presenting. Can you guys see that at the back? No? Okay. While nothing is working, I'll say hi. So my name is Simon Rogers. I am the data editor at the Google News Lab. I've obviously disconnected something important, so we'll just talk for a little bit. I do a job that my parents don't really understand what I do, so I will try and explain it to you. So the idea of today's session, I was told that I was to talk about the tools that we're doing. So what I thought I would do is talk about the work that we're doing with data journalism, some of the tools we're working on, and and data journalism. Does that sound all right? And then what we can do at the end is we can take some questions, and then we'll go from there. So yeah, I work for the Google News Lab as part of the Google News Initiative. This is really not working. Okay, I'm going to reload it, and we'll go from there. All right, we'll give that a go, and we'll see what happens. Okay, so I work for the Google News Lab, which is part of the Google News Initiative. And what the Google News Lab does is like a bridge between Google and the world of journalism. And partly that's because Google is this huge company, size of a small city, and for journalists often it's kind of difficult to get into. But also for us, we want to be a place inside Google that speaks up for journalism and helps journalists get the stuff that they need. We have people all over the world in lots of different places working with the news industry. And we focus on these kind of big areas of trust and misinformation, local news reporting, inclusive journalism, and emerging technologies. And my bit is really around data. So I run this small team within the News Lab, which basically is a team of kind of young data journalists, people at the beginning of their careers. And what we do is kind of, I'm going to show you some of this stuff because it's a bit easier, but really we create content around Google data. We work on trying to explain it to the world, but we also help the news industry out there get hold of some of that data and make it easier for people to use and get hold of. So I'm always asked this, so I thought I would just kind of jump to it straight away. Like, why would Google care about data journalism, and why would Google employ a data journalist? So, of course, this is working. Can I get a clicker, please? So, first thing to say is that data journalism, as you know from today and from these events here, data journalism is now mainstream.
When we started the data blog back at The Guardian in 2009, there weren't that many organizations who were doing this stuff, but now it's everywhere. So I'm director of the Data Journalism Awards, and we had hundreds of entries this year. And we did a survey last year which found that half of all newsrooms now have a dedicated data journalist. And it's not just in the US or the UK, or even mainstream Europe, it's happening kind of around the world, where you've got like basically most of digital newsrooms, which now all newsrooms have a dedicated data journalist or a data journalism team. Thank you. And we saw that with the entries for the Data Journalism Awards this year. We had 630 entries. I'm director of the awards, so I've just been going through the shortlist, and we're going to announce the shortlist tomorrow. But it's incredible going through this list now. It was a time when we first started it, all the entries were from the US in the past, they were all from UK and so on, but now they're from all over the world, and half of them, over half of them, are from small newsrooms. Often people would say to me, data journalism, isn't that really expensive? How can we afford to do it? Now everybody's doing it. It's not something that just belongs to the big news organizations anymore. And 57 countries, 330 news organizations, it's very much a mainstream thing. So why does Google care about all of this? Well, I guess, Google's kind of been around with data journalism for a while. We have a ton of kind of legacy tools, things that people use, fusion tables, mapping. Google spreadsheets are pretty much the back end for half of the interactives that you see online now. So these are tools that people use every day, but also the world of data journalism is changing. And even though there are more and more people doing it, there are also more and more challenges to working with data. And so we've been thinking a lot about what those challenges are. It's something I think about a lot. I think about what can I do to help that? What can I do to meaningfully make that better? The first thing we've tried to do is make access to key data easier. So for Google, that really means access to Google search data, Google Trends. Now, for a company that people associate with data, not a lot of people know what Google data is. So I'm going to take a little detour and show you kind of how I understand Google data work and the kind of data that we work with. So the first thing to say about Google data is there's a lot of it, billions of searches every day. It's an incredibly kind of unique data set that takes you beyond the echo chamber of social media. It's something that's just out there. I made this map of, these are cities around the world where we could theoretically get data from. So we can get data globally for the whole world, get data for a country, for a region, even for a city, but we can't go any lower than that. So I cannot tell you what your mother is searching for, but I can tell you what the town is searching for where you live. And those towns are amazing. It's like, this is a map, I made this in Kato, which is something you all use, and I took away the boundaries. So there's no map here, it's just a map of dots, essentially. And you can see how it reflects where people are, reflects the natural contours of our lives. And that's the way that we search, right? This is something that's kind of ever-present in what we do. It goes down to kind of that level. There's also an honesty to search data, which is really powerful. You're never as honest as you are with your search engine. So this is something that I made around the way people search for gun shop in America versus gun control. The idea being buying guns or controlling them. And you can see how it changes after major events. So the average is that people are more likely to search for buying guns in America than for controlling them, except for after big shooting events, and except for in Kentucky, where people always search for buying guns, it turns out. But you can use that data to kind of get at changing attitudes. So this is something we did with the Washington Post, and they were looking at searches for same-sex marriage over time. So we picked out the top 10 searches around same-sex marriage going back to 2004 and could show it annually. And you can see that, and then we categorized them. They're categorized with the Washington Post into neutral, i.e. informational, people asking for, how do I get a marriage license? Positive, being people actively, proposing same-sex marriage, and negative, people, searching for anti-search and so on. And you can see how in 2004 a lot of states were pretty negative and how that shifted. Our attitudes change over time, and search is a really good way to get to that, and partly that's because of that honesty thing. The honesty really reflects in other moments that you find that happen when things show up. So these are searches for the phrase "move to Canada," and that there is Super Tuesday in 2016 when Donald Trump won in 7 states. So you can see how things happen, and then search data will reflect changes for it. We've used this in a number of ways recently. This is something we did a couple of weeks ago, and this is with new data, which showed not necessarily just where people were searching for, but where people were actually visiting. So the restaurants that people were going for. So you've got this amazing kind of food maps of the US, seeing where people search for pizza or where people search for coffee or visited restaurant types. This is a new data set we started working with. And part of our job is really, within the News Lab, is to try and surface this data and make it easier for people to use and to open it up. I really think there's a responsibility for us to be as open as possible and to get the data out there and into the hands of people who can do interesting things with it. There's a lot of interesting stuff about this data around the way that people ask questions. We've noticed a real increase in people asking, almost like conversationally, how do I do something? What is this? How does this work? But you can also reflect kind of national differences. So, for instance, these are the top 10 questions top 5 questions of last year in Italy on pizza. And they feel to me they're quite informed. How to make a good pizza, who invented it, is pizza our thing, what does gourmet pizza mean, how to make pizza like in a pizzeria. In the US, it turns out the questions are quite different, which is how many slices in a large pizza, how many calories, where did pizza originate, how much to tip the pizza delivery guy, which I can tell you living in America, this is a big thing. And I feel this is maybe West Coast, how to make cauliflower pizza crust, which feels wrong on many levels. But you can see how it's different, right? And it's different in different countries, and it reflects how the world is different, right? We're not all the same. We don't search things in the same way. We search for things in different ways. I was told to speak slowly. Am I speaking too fast? Is it okay? All right, I'll try and slow down a little bit. But you can do other things too. So this map shows searches for croissant and searches for donut. I'd like you to guess which color represents croissant and which color represents donuts. So you can really get a sense of who we are as people from the way that people search. It's kind of an incredibly powerful thing. Most of these things you can do on the Google Trends website, and you can download that data as CSVs. The other thing about the data, which I wasn't expecting, is how immediate it is. As soon as something happens in the world, we want to search. We want to find out what's going on. And we often see this with live events. We can see during a debate or during a football match or during an election campaign, something happens and it changes the way that people search. So this is something we made with a designer called Attalla. I hope you can see it all right. I don't know if there's a way to bring the lights down a little bit here. But this was looking at searches after the big Paris attacks a couple of years ago. We wanted to see how quickly, how long it took before people started searching in other countries around the globe for those events. And it turns out, and this is maybe not a surprise, that people start searching within moments, that the news can travel around the world and get to Sydney or Thailand or Madrid or Toronto or San Francisco within minutes. People are searching because they've heard about it and they want to know about it. It doesn't matter what time of day it is. Because search has made us this global community, and we know how fast information and, I guess, misinformation can spread around the globe. But you can see those kind of changing attitudes in lots of other data too. So this was in election day, 2016. And often what we do is we look at how to refine the searches we're looking for. So 3 years ago, we didn't have real-time search data in Google Trends. It was all 3 days old. And then we got real-time data, which means it's 3 minutes old. So instead of knowing what happened 3 days ago, we now know what happened 3 minutes ago. But what we found is that the data can sometimes be messy. So if you just search for Trump versus Clinton, for instance, you've got all the noise that associates around Donald Trump, say, kind of permeates into the search and makes it hard to work out what's going on. But if you add terms like vote Clinton versus vote Trump, it's like the gunshot versus gun control thing. You can really see how on election day things start to spread out and how they kind of match the polling right up until the last minute. So because this data is new, we're always thinking about how to get the best kind of understanding about it. We also think a lot about other things you can do with the data. So one of the things that's particularly useful is this thing of related searches. So if you search for one thing, what else do you search for? So we did this during the primary campaign in the 2016 election. It was looking for all the candidates and who the other candidates were that people searched in order. I guess the point of this was, if somebody dropped out, where would that search interest go? Who would care about somebody else? So we just started looking at this data, and there's some other interesting stuff we found, which, for instance, In counties that expressed a lot of search interest in, say, Ted Cruz, they were very interested in the oil industry also, and guns and Chevy trucks, which is maybe not a surprise. In counties that searched for Donald Trump, people were searching for kids' activities and minivans and gaming consoles, right? It's a different world. He won because of suburban parents, right? And you can see that in the way that people search, which is an incredibly powerful thing. So we also try and showcase other data too. These are YouTube views by county during the election campaign for each candidate's videos, the official videos of each candidate. And what's interesting to me about this is you can see near the end of the campaign how certain states went red. And anybody who knows anything about American politics will tell you, right? It's Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Florida. These are key states, and these states went red in the way that people were watching videos. This is an indicator, right? All these things are indicators. People often say, oh, is it predictive? And I don't know if search data is predictive or not. However, it is a really powerful social signal. It's not a replacement for polling or anything like that, but it is a powerful social signal. It doesn't not mean anything. It means something. We just don't know what that something is yet. So to give you a sense of the way people search, I wanted to look at the way people search in Italy. So these are searches in Italy. And when I started this job, we were always looking for something that would be a constant in search, something that would give us a reference point for other searches. And that something was Kim Kardashian. Turns out a lot of people search Kim Kardashian, maybe not a surprise. But things have changed a little bit. And actually, there is another person who is more searched even than Kim Kardashian. This is Italy, by the way, in the last week. But that doesn't really help us that much. So obviously you've had an election in Italy. There's a lot of political discussion. You think politics would be a huge issue in the way that people search. And it is quite big, but no bigger than Donald Trump, it turns out. So what I needed was something that was so big it would put all of this into context. And again, these are searches in Italy. And I did find something, which was... So it turns out that's what people care about in Italy, which anybody could have told you, I guess. But actually seeing it confirmed in search makes it interesting. So often when we're looking at search data, it's important not to just use it in isolation. If you look at one thing, you can say, oh, there's a 2,000% spike in searches for cauliflower pizza, say. It doesn't mean anything unless you can see where it really fits. And we're incredibly eclectic as people, right? We search for lots of things. We may search for Kim Kardashian, Donald Trump, and football in the same search query. That's the amazing thing about search. It kind of gives you that window into the way people work. So we run a curation team, and my team basically is a mixture of different things. We create this kind of content, maps and visuals. If you're not following at Google Trends now, it's a good time to follow us. But we also work a lot with newsrooms. Say you're after that data set you can't get hold of, we'll try and track that down and work with you on interpreting it and visualizing it. And we also work a lot on thinking about how we can support data journalism as a whole. Often that's through tools. We also work on projects like Electionland. Does everybody know about Electionland? Okay, so for anybody who doesn't, this was a project that was with ProPublica. And the idea was to monitor on election day the problems that people have in terms of voting. Because every year, every time there's an election in the US, people say, oh, there's long lines in this state, but they can't find the voting station. So what if we could find those stories and then verify them? So this turned into the largest single-day collaborative reporting exercise in history. There's 1,000 reporters gathered around the US and in this reporting center at CUNY in New York. And it became this amazing kind of resource of stories which looked at whether there were voting issues or the voting fraud issues, the way people vote and so on. We did this live map of search terms that were spiking above average. So you can see this is a kind of recreation of election day in search terms for things like long wait times or provisional ballots, which is where you go in and you ask for a new voting slip because you can't vote, or voter intimidation or voting machine problems, which did become an issue. So the idea is this would then be a signal for the journalists to go out and check these things are happening, find the voting station where it was going on, and really see if the story was true or not. And I think that's where this data can become really powerful because it can help people understand that. We're now involved in this project, which is called Documenting Hate, which is again run with ProPublica. And the idea of documenting hate is that there is anecdotal evidence in the US that there is there are increasing cases of hate crime going on over time, but there's no real evidence. And the reason there's no real evidence is because there's no proper national data. States do not have to report hate crimes, so they don't. So the idea of documenting hate is to gather up those crimes into a database and create a proper database around these stories. And we've been thinking a lot about how we can support that, and I'll show you later on one of the projects we've done around that. The other thing we think about a lot is opening up the data and making it available. We have a GitHub page. We've also got a page on Kaggle. I don't know if anybody uses Kaggle in here. Anybody use Kaggle? It's amazing. There's 1.5 million data scientists on Kaggle, so we put our data on there as well. And the idea for that is that because trends data can seem weird sometimes and difficult to use, we want people to use it. I want people to go out and download one of these data sets and make their own visuals, better than our visuals, hopefully. And that's there, and every day or every week we'll put on new data sets on there for people to play with. It feels to me like, I mean, I'll talk about this a lot, but open data and open data journalism have always gone hand in hand. They're like two sides of the same coin as far as data journalism is concerned. There's no point being clever if you can't share what you're working on and share your data. The other thing we've worked on, this is another project with ProPublica, is something called the election data bot. So in America, election boundaries are terribly confusing. There's like midterms happening in November. There's all the House members that will be up, the Senate members that will be up. These are thousands of counties and congressional district areas across the US. So the idea of the data bot is to gather all of that data into one place. So what we have there is spending data and polling data and deleted tweets and Facebook ads and Google News stories about each candidate, all kind of gathered into one place, and trending candidates, so you can see which candidate is being searched over somebody else. So the idea is to make that data available. There's an amazing notification system they built into it, so you can see how people are searching and what's happening in each place. So the idea behind that is really kind of bringing all that data together and trying to make it more available. There's a lot of other challenges to being a data journalist, and one of which is that 80% of your work is quite boring because it's cleaning up messy data, dealing with all the merged cells and the ridiculousness in it. So I think about this a lot because I spend a lot of my time doing it. So one of the things we're doing is we are funding a new development on OpenRefine. I don't know if anybody here uses OpenRefine. OpenRefine is still the best way to clean up messy data. And because it's been run by the community, it was originally Google Refine, put out to the community, and we wanted to give them the space to develop that and add all the new things it needs. So there'll be an OpenRefine version 3.0, which will be launching sometime next few months. They'll have loads more improvements in it. It connects better with spreadsheets, connects better with bigger data sets, and again, it's about cleaning up data and making it easier for people to use. I'm going to give the translator a break for a second. The other thing we think a lot about is how you begin. So one of the things that working on the Data Journalism Awards shows me is how people are starting to get into data journalism everywhere around the world. It's not just here in Italy or Germany or the US or wherever. It's in Nigeria, in Kenya, and in the Philippines. It's happening all over the place. So we're thinking a lot about how we can support that. So one of the things we're building is a data journalism curriculum. And the idea of that is to give people a starting place. I'm actually teaching as well. I'm teaching at the Medill School in campus in San Francisco, and we're trying out a lot of this course in action. And the idea is all of these tools that I show you, there's little video courses and ways to start on that. We're also supporting, really happy to support the Data Journalism Handbook, which was last published in 2011. It's an amazing resource. Students use it all over the world. And working with the EJC, and Jonathan and Liliana, who I don't know if are in here, really happy to support that and make sure it's an incredible product, which I'm really happy that's going to be coming out again soon. We also think a lot about visualization. A lot of people confuse data journalism and visualization into one thing. They think it's the same thing, but visualization is obviously a crucial part of data journalism. So one of the things we've done is funded this tool called Flourish. I think Duncan from Flourish is going to be here tomorrow. Is there anybody who hasn't heard of Flourish? Okay. You've got to sign up for Flourish. You get free, one thing we're doing is we're funding free accounts for journalists. And the thing about Flourish is what it allows people to do is they can upload any visualization to it, and then it can be reused again and again. Now, anybody who's not a coder, who's tried to persuade a developer to rebuild that visualization for the 14th time, will know how difficult that is. So what Flourish does is there are a ton of templates in there now. You can make these visuals without being a coder. You just upload your data, change the text, change the look of it, and you've got a new visualization which can be embedded or downloaded and embedded on your own site. And again, it's kind of, we want that to be open, so anybody who wants a journalism account should sign up for it, let them know you're a journalist, because you'll get a free account, and you'll be able to use that to create these incredible visuals that you don't have to be a coder, which is handy for me. The thing we thought a lot about is about data viz. So a lot of companies make data visualizations. You know, this has become a big thing. So we thought, and the problem is they all start to look the same after a while. And frankly, it means they all end up looking like marketing exercises. So what we thought was, how can we use our budget for good? Right? How can we make stuff that actually is a good project? So what we decided to do was to work with great designers, people like Alberto Cairo, Moritz Stefana, and Nadia Bremer, and Giorgia Lupi, and Joaquin GB. And the idea was to say to them, you can do what you want. We'll give you the budget, you can do what you want. The main things are, it's got to be mobile first, and it's got to be open source, so anybody can redo it, and it's got to be doing something different. I'm going to show you some of the work we've done. We've worked with We Do Data for the French election, where they were taking search data and looking at issues that were associated with each candidate, which is a tricky data exercise. And we were then publishing that data online as a GitHub exercise, and we did it right at the beginning of the campaign, and when we got down to the two candidates, we just showed them. Moritz worked on this great project for the German election. He reinvented the word cloud, which is something that some people get really anxious about, but I think he's done a really nice job on it. And the idea was, again, to use search data to kind of look at how people search for different candidates, the kind of issues, the things they associate with those candidates, and to find new ways of showing that data. We said to him, you know, you can do what you want as long as it's something different, and everything has to be embeddable and open source and usable kind of again and again. And what was interesting in Germany was how closely it reflected what was going on in the campaign, how certain issues would flare up and you'd see them in the data. We did a similar thing with Giorgia Lupi and the Accurate team for the US, and these were basically treating the US election as a world election, because everybody cares about the US election around the world, and look at the issues that people search for with different candidates. This is something that Nadia Bremer built, and what she wanted to look at was the words that people search for to translate into English in different languages. So if you speak Japanese, what words in English do you search for? If you speak French, what words in English do you search for? And she made this incredibly beautiful exercise. It also shows you things that actually most of the words that we search for are quite boring. The things like days of the week or work or whatever, but seeing it across different nationalities is really kind of a powerful thing. This was something we did with Moritz Stefana, and what he wanted to look at was the way that people search for food over time. So we have all this data. Food is, you know, that's how we all search for recipes, right? Or we all search for how to make stuff, how to buy stuff, what to do with it. But what he wanted to show was years and dates and months in one chart. Now, you could have done a load of little line charts, but there's something about trying to bring it together in this particular visualization, which is really beautiful. And it also has the benefit, unintentional benefit, that some of these charts look like food, which was not intended. It kind of happened. Look at the gefilte fish and the pear and the donut. It's kind of an amazing thing. But you can see how there's things on donuts that, you know, there's a scandal about a pop star stealing a bunch of donuts from a bakery, and that makes Donut Search or National Donut Day or whatever. And some of this is seasonal because of, you know, religious reasons or because of kind of food festivals. Again, because search reflects the way that we live. This was something, this is still my favorite project, which is referred to internally as the toilet project. And the idea was that because we noticed there's a real spike in the way people search for how do I do something? And it turns out that we all do that, right? We all search, how do I fix this? How do I mend this thing that's broken in my life? So this was, Joaquin did this, who used to be graphics director at The Guardian. And he turned it into kind of a very visual essay about, and it's kind of an interesting, gives an interesting sense of what people search for. So I don't know if you can see this, but these little pink dots, can you see the pink dots? They show the global average for how people search how to fix each thing. So in the UK, for instance, people are kind of on average for fixing washing machines and doors, a little bit above global average for fixing the toilet, under for fixing windows, crazy high above it for fixing light bulbs. I actually think, now that I don't live in the UK, that people in the UK are obsessed with light bulbs and getting to work because they haven't had eco light bulbs for a while. But it's different in different countries. So in France, people are fine with their light bulbs, but washing machines obviously causing trouble on windows. Look at windows there, way above global average. And sinks, look at sinks, way above global average. But in Italy, doors are under, windows a bit over, toilets are on average. Washing machines, what is this? Italian washing machines, is this a thing? I don't know, I want to know about Italian washing machines now. I understand why. And fridges, refrigerators and washing machines seem to be a big thing. So again, it's kind of like, when he did this, all the data's online, it's open source, but it's kind of fun as well. And I think, we all know that visualizations, increasingly, we need to think about who we're speaking to when we make visualizations. Are we speaking to people like us? Or are we speaking to the rest of the world? Or do we want our parents and our grandparents to understand what we're doing, or do we just want our colleagues to understand? And that feels to me like a key thing when you're visualizing anything. So we've done some other tools as well. This is something called tilegrams, which makes cartograms. So we noticed this before the last election. There was a real increase in people making cartograms, maps that don't look like maps. And they're difficult to do. So for instance, 530, I think, used Illustrator to make their cartograms every day, which felt like there must be a better way to do this, right? So we built this with a team called Pitch in Oakland, and what it does is it's on GitHub. It's just a really quick tool to make a cartogram. You can make any country. There are some templates on there for major kind of countries and their electorates. You can make you can make your own. You can download it either as an SVG or as a JSON file to embed or upload. And we're starting to think ahead now, like what's it going to look like next year? What do we do next year that's different? So we've decided to focus less on kind of our data and more on innovation. So for instance, generative art is it's one of those things that people have started to get into, but it's really hard to do. It's really hard to do without being a developer. So how do you make that? So we're working with Datavized, who are based in New York. And we're going to build a tool that anybody can upload their own data set and make a piece of generative art. And then we're going to do the same thing with sonification, like what would data sound like? If you can make a data set sound like something, what would it sound like? And how would you do that? How do you make a tool that anybody can then use to upload their own data? So the idea is really here, it's about thinking, a lot of newsrooms don't have the time to explore as much as they might want to. So we do have that. So what can we do that's then useful for people to use and use again? We thought a lot about data journalism on mobile. So for instance, we have AMP, which is a great mobile platform, doesn't work so well with data journalism, and there's a whole project internally to improve that. We've also got this tool called the Data GIF Maker. This was something we used internally because we often want to compare two things and see how they change over time. And so now we made it so anybody can upload their own data and use it again. You download a GIF. Because it's amazing, as visualization has become more sophisticated, the visuals that most of us share out there in the world have become less sophisticated because we consume stuff on mobile. Was it now that 50% of news is consumed on mobile in most countries now? And some countries like in Asia, it's all on mobile. So a lot of visualizations don't work. So we're thinking a lot about GIFs, and we're going to add some new things to that as well. So the other things we think a lot about are AR and VR. These are kind of things which are incredibly powerful for newsrooms, and they're incredibly powerful visual tools, but they're not straightforward to use often. They're kind of difficult and tricky. I first started thinking about this during Brexit. So we did this visual which showed the questions that people ask in different EU countries about Brexit, just ahead of the vote. And it's kind of 3D-ish. So what if we turned that into a VR data viz? So we worked with Pitch Interactive in Oakland to do that, and taught me lots of things about making visuals in VR. One of which is that people can actually get physically sick with VR. Has anybody experienced this? It's a real thing. Like if you haven't got somewhere to stand on or somewhere that's below you, you can actually feel sick. And the other thing I learned is that you can't put much content on because you can't read a lot. If it's like this, you're not going to read a massive paragraph of text or see a load of numbers. So we sprinted on this, and we did it in 2 weeks. And it taught us all this stuff about making a VR visual, but it's still the thing, well, we should make that process easier for people to use. So we've added these templates to Flourish, now where you can make a VR network chart. And this just shows the way that people search for TV shows and what else they search for a TV show. You can do it with anything you want to do. So that's on Flourish now, and it says, and there are a couple of templates on there for people to use and play with. All you need is the data. You don't have to be a coder or a kind of VR designer. You can get that, and you're creating a VR visual with any data you want. We're going to do the same kind of thing with AR. So we're working with Accurate on a AR tool which will open source as a way to, they're thinking a lot around the idea of hope. What are people hopeful for? What do you care about? Because everything is so miserable at the moment. We thought we should try and feel hopeful. And the idea of the visual is you say what you're hopeful for and you create this shape which you then place somewhere. Other people place theirs around too, you can find them. It's going to be great. But the idea is when we do something like that, again, is to make it open source and write about how we did it so people understand what the point is and how to use AR in a kind of informational or data viz context. We thought a lot also about AI. Google is obsessed with AI as a company, and it's something we think, well, how can we use AI in the newsroom? And so there are journalists out there who've been doing this. Peter Aldhus at BuzzFeed has done some amazing projects using AI in looking at spy planes and videos and so on. So one of the things we're thinking about is creating these kind of very simple tools. Oh, I'm going to run out of time, aren't I? Simple tools around artificial intelligence newsrooms. So we've been building little tools, and partly this is proof of concept. So we've just made one, which we're trialing with the Washington Post and Hearst, which is using the Google Language API to create a tool for transcribing audio and video files. So I've spent years of my life transcribing interviews. What if I could get a computer to do it for me? So that's the idea of that tool, but it's partly just to show if it's possible, and then we'll show how we did that. We've also, I talked a bit before about documenting hate. So this is a project we built for documenting hate, and what that does, that takes all the news articles around hate crimes and starts to categorize them. So Google News, when you look at Google News, has a set of articles. Most of the ones you see are from trusted sources, big news outlets. But for stories around hate crime, we wanted the small news outlets. We wanted the newspaper in the middle of Oregon that might have a story about something. So that's what this project does. We take all of those stories, there's about 8,000 in there now, and we use the natural language processing API to read through them all and categorize them. So then it becomes more of a tip-off sheet. A reporter can then use that to check out some of these stories and see if they work. Talk really quickly about Data Journalism Awards. It's a really important thing for us. Marianne's happy there. We're going to announce a shortlist tomorrow at the Data Journalism Unconference. So you can find out who's up for an award. It's an incredible shortlist this year. Really excited about it. I think it's going to be really good. And what's impressive to me is how many of those really incredible entries have come from around the world, not just from the big newsrooms, not just from the ones you might expect. So that's it for me. This is what we do. I've got like 10 minutes, I think, before we get thrown out for questions. I just want to give you guys a sense of what we're doing. I'm going to get my headphones so I can understand, but yeah. Hi, you have one. Hi. I think there's a microphone. Is there a microphone?
I can ask you the question in English.
Okay, sure, great.
Okay. So I have a couple of very practical and maybe naive questions.
Okay.
Let's say I'm just a journalist and I'm not a newsroom. Could I just write to Google Trends and say, hey, Google Trends, I'd like to publish a story, I don't know, about the Italian election and Google searches. Could you help me out with that?
So you could use, I mean, Google Trends as a tool has got a lot of like local filters. You could filter down to regions within Italy. You actually wouldn't need us for a lot of it. I think you could do a lot of stuff around how people are searching, major search terms, candidates without us. But yeah, we get people coming to us all the time, and we want to help. So we'll help as much as we can, but often what we'll try and do is say, you can use this tool for yourself, and it's super easy to use. And if you want to ask me at the end, I'll show you some things. Sorry, I probably should have done a bit of that today, but okay. Any other questions? Yeah.
So are most of these tools free just for journalists?
Yeah.
All right.
Absolutely.
So if you're not a journalist, you don't get access to that.
Most of them, most of the things like Tilegrams, Flourish, you can access Flourish without being a journalist. You get a different account, you're a journalist. But most of the, what we're thinking about is journalism. Doesn't mean you can't use the tools. You want to make a data GIF, go right ahead. It's out there and they're free and they're open source. We're trying to put as few barriers in there as possible.
So you ask for it?
No, well, some of them are just open. You just go and use them. You don't need to ask for it at all. But I think Flourish, you have to sign up for it, but yeah.
I was just wondering if the amount of information that is available is the same everywhere in the world. For instance, I work in the Middle East and I'm based there, so I'm thinking language barriers, how does it work?
So what you'll find is in some countries there's just less search interest, and that affects the data. But and what I find is you can normally get something from everywhere. There are some countries where Google's not present, right, and there's nothing we can do about that. But in countries where it is, often is using those big search terms and comparing what you're doing to those big search terms can help. You'll normally find people always search for football, say. You can normally find and use that as a way to work out how big searches are. So, but we've got, that's what the Trends tool has got 200 odd countries on there. So it has data down to a regional and even city level for those countries. So there's a lot of information there. Yeah, you should be able to find stuff. Those sites, say if you're in a Middle Eastern country, and then the searches would come back in Arabic anyway. So.
Hi Simon, I'm John Goodell from the BJTC, the Broadcast Journalism Training Council in the UK. We have about 4,000 students training as journalists at the moment in the UK. You talked about the data module, the data curriculum that you're developing. Are you looking at extending that into other parts of the world, and what would the process be?
Yeah, so there is a Google News Lab University network. I don't know if you guys are part of that, I hope so.
Yeah.
But then there's already access to a lot of training materials there. We've got videos online, as they are right now, and we're just working on this curriculum at the moment. We're hoping to spread that out to everybody. It should be open to anybody. We don't want to put any barriers in the way of that either.
I work for a School of Data, and I'm interested in knowing if you work also with more NGOs and CSOs who do journalism work without being newsrooms.
Yeah, a lot of the entries we have to the Data Journalism Awards from NGOs. And there's some amazing work going on there. Absolutely. Certainly, we might partner up with an NGO to produce a piece of content, say, or visualizations. We did that with the American Society of Newspaper Editors. We did a visualization showing diversity in newsrooms over time and how that's changed. We worked on the Open News, News Nerd Survey, and the ICFJ stuff. And we tend to focus stuff that's around journalism, but sometimes if it's a big topic that's of interest to journalists, we'll cooperate on that as well. I think there's one here. Oh, in the front as well. Sorry.
Hi, Simon.
Hi.
Is there any plan to launch like a car tool, tool, how Google Maps is powerful?
We actually use Carto, but I mean Google Maps.
You use it, but
I use it. My team uses it, but we use Google Maps on Carto. We just use it for the interface. I really like Carto. I'm a big fan of it. I think Google Maps. I know is always developing. There's a lot of right now. You've got Fusion Tables and My Maps. And Google Maps. There's a lot of tools there, so I think we're having a lot of discussions about how that looks in the future. But right now, I don't have anything to report, I'm afraid. But we will do, I'm sure, in the near future. I think there's one at the front, sorry.
Hi, you said it's free for journalists. How would you assess who's a journalist and who's not? I mean, do you ask for accreditation, or also freelancers could?
So we leave that up to, you mean the Flourish tool? Yeah, so we leave that up to Kiln, who runs that. But when you sign up for Flourish, if you go on there, there's a category that says newsroom, and you just have to say where you work, I think. But yeah, they run that because we're a small team.
What if you work freelance and don't have a company email address?
Sorry?
What if you work freelance and don't have a company email address?
I don't think it matters. We let freelancers can join it up as well. I think it doesn't just have to be big newsrooms. And there's one at the back, I think.
Hi, Stuart Lau from the Reuters Institute. May I know how AI could be deployed by journalists in future? What's your view of how it can actually happen in journalism? Thank you.
So we've come up with, actually, we brainstormed, we thought a lot about this, and we came up with 4 things that we want to build. So one of which is a transcription tool. I mentioned that. I think transcribing audio, video, boring task, but really important, and seems like a natural. And the tests we've done so far have been really encouraging, like a lot of accuracy and speed. It takes it takes about 20% of the time, the length of the file to transcribe it. Which, imagine if we could get that to words. That would be great. We think a lot. I think content classification. Like we have a ton of content. How can that be classified? And exploration. If when you're doing a big research job, if you have thousands of articles, the stuff we did with documenting hate, I think classifying those articles by subject and topic is really, really important. I think image recognition, recognizing images, having photographs from a news event, a big crowd of people finding images in there, I think that could be really powerful use as well. So I think even if those things happen, that would be revolutionary for a lot of newsrooms. So it's definitely where we're going, and anything we can do to support that is going to be really important, I think. Okay, anything else? Great. Okay, thank you guys. Thanks so much. I'll be here for a little bit if anybody has any questions, but thank you so much for coming.